I married a man I had never spoken to until the morning of the wedding, and I did it on purpose. 5 months later, I stood in his sister's parlor and told the room where his second wife was. And it was not in the churchyard where every one of them had sent flowers. 9 people heard me say it. They had all signed her burial book with their own hands, and they had all gone home afterward and eaten their suppers. My name was written in the marriage register as Verna Ames. It was the only false thing in that parlor, and it was mine, and I had put it there on purpose too. But it did not begin in a parlor with the gas turned up and a woman in black bombazine telling me to sit down before I disgraced myself. It began 9 years earlier, in a cold dormitory at a girls' seminary outside of Lancaster, with a brass-bound album and a line of ink I have never once been able to read straight through without putting my hand over my mouth. "Yours till the mill wheel stops." That was the line. She wrote it in a good round hand with a flourish under it, the way girls did then, and she signed it with her 2 initials, and she gave me back the album and went out to ring the bell for prayers. She was 21 years old, and she had no idea what she had promised. Before we go on, tell me in the comments where you are listening from tonight. It always amazes me how far these stories travel, and how many kitchens and long drives and dark bedrooms they end up in. Now settle in, because this one took me 3 years to understand, and it will take us a while to get there together. I came to Rockridge Female Seminary in the fall I turned 14, sent there on my father's last good year. He kept a dry goods store in Bell Furnace, a town that lived on a foundry and died with it. And in the autumn of that year, he still believed that a man who was careful and honest and up at 5 in the morning could not be ruined. He bought me 2 wool dresses and a trunk with brass corners and put me on the train himself. He said the Kelsos had never sent a girl to school before, and I had better make it worth the money. Then he stood on the platform with his hat in his hand and did not wave, because waving was for people who were not sure they would see you again. The seminary was a long stone building with a bell on top of it and no heat in the upper rooms after 9 at night. There were 40 girls and 6 teachers and a principal named Miss Peck, whom we called the Peck behind her back, and who could hear a whisper through 2 doors. We rose at 5:30. We washed in water with a skin of ice on it in January. We learned French and composition and the use of the globes and enough arithmetic to keep a household book, and we were taught that a lady's voice should never be heard above the sound of a room. The drawing teacher that year was not properly a teacher at all. She was a Philadelphia girl of 21 named Delphine Rourke, whose people had put her there to finish, and who had stayed on to teach the little ones drawing and to keep the upstairs dormitory in order, because her uncle paid her tuition, and she would not take it as charity. She had black hair that would not stay pinned, and a way of standing with one hip against a door frame that the Peck detested. When she laughed, she put her whole head back, and it carried down the stairwell, and twice a week she was spoken to about it. I was the poorest girl in that dormitory, and I knew it before I had my trunk unpacked. My dresses were good wool, but they were the wrong year. I said warsh instead of wash, the way they said it at home, and a girl named Cornelia Prather corrected me in front of 11 others at the supper table, sweetly, the way you would correct a child or a servant. I did not cry until I was upstairs. I was sitting on the end of my bed with my face in a pillow that smelled of somebody else's hair oil when the door opened and Delphine Rourke came in with a candle and sat down on the trunk across from me and did not say one single kind word. What she said was, "Warsh is how they say it in Bell Furnace, and Belle Furnace makes the iron that holds up the bridge that Cornelia Prather's father drives over to get to his bank. You go down and say it again at breakfast." I looked up at her with my face swollen. She had the candle under her chin, and it made her look like a picture in a storybook, the kind with a warning attached. "I could not," I said. "You could," she said. "You will find that people are afraid of a girl who does not apologize for where she is from. It is the apologizing they smell." She stood up and shook out her skirt and looked at me the way a person looks at a horse they are thinking of buying. "Come down to the drawing room after prayers. I will teach you to make a straight line. It is a useless accomplishment, and it will calm you." That was how it began, and for 2 years it did not stop. I went down to the drawing room 3 evenings a week and made straight lines, and then boxes, and then a bad rendering of a picture, and while I made them, she talked. She talked about Philadelphia, about her uncle Ephraim Rourke, who was a wool broker on Front Street, and the only one of her family who had any use for her. She talked about how she meant to keep her own money when she married, whatever any man said about it, because her uncle had told her that a woman with her own money is a woman with her own opinions. She talked about the mills up in the coal counties and the mills down in the river towns, and how you could tell a man's character by whether he called his hands or his people. I was 14 and then 15, and I thought she was the most complete human being I had ever seen. She was not. She had a temper that came up out of nowhere like a squall on water. She could be careless with a person and never know she had been. Once, she took a girl's part in a quarrel and then forgot the whole thing by Thursday while the girl was still crying over it. But she saw me. That is the thing I have never been able to explain to anybody who wanted me to be reasonable about all this. In a building with 40 girls in it, she saw the one who had no money and no polish and a way of saying "warsh," and she decided that I was worth her trouble, and she never once let me feel that I was her charity. In the spring before I left, she was writing in albums, because that is what they did at the end of a term. Every girl had one, and every girl carried it around and got the others to write a verse and a name. Mine was a cheap thing, brass corners on a pasteboard board, bought out of my father's own stock and carried up on the train in the bottom of the trunk. I asked her last of all, because I was afraid she would write something formal, the way a teacher would, and that I would have to look at it for the rest of my life. She took it into the window seat and thought for a long time. The window was open, and the mill on the creek below the school was running, and you could hear it, a low sound under everything, the way you hear your own blood at night. Then she wrote her line and blew on it and shut the book and gave it back to me. "Yours till the mill wheel stops. D.R." "That is not a verse," I said. "It is better than a verse," she said. "A verse is a thing you say. That is a thing you can hold a person to." Then the bell rang, and she went to ring it, and I sat in the window seat with the album on my knees for a good while after she had gone. I left Rockridge that June and did not go back, because the foundry at Belle Furnace shut its doors in the fall, and the town went down with it like a barn going down in a wind, slow at first, and then all at once. My father kept the store open another 6 years on nothing but credit and stubbornness. There was no more money for schooling. I came home and I kept his books, and I learned exactly how much a man can lose without ever admitting out loud that he has lost anything. We wrote. That is what I had of her for 4 years after I came home, and I have every one of the letters still, in a tin box, tied with the kind of string you save off a parcel. She wrote from Philadelphia, from her uncle's house on Rourke Street. long letters with ink on the sides where she had turned the paper to save postage. She wrote about the concerts. She wrote about a man who had proposed to her and about exactly how she had gotten out of it. She wrote about her uncle's cough and about the doctor who came for it and did no good. When my mother died, she wrote me 8 pages, and there was not one line of comfort in them of the ordinary kind, and it was the only letter I could stand to read that whole winter. Then, in the autumn of the year I was 17, she wrote to say that she was going to be married. His name was Junius Ames. He was a widower of 45 who owned a woolen mill on the Wissahick Creek in Sadler County, and he had come to her uncle's counting house to sell his wool, and had stayed to dinner 3 times, and on the 3rd time he had asked her, plainly, standing up, with his hat in his hands, and she had said yes. I read that letter twice, and I did not like it, and I could not have told you why. She was 24, and he was 45. That was not so unusual then. Men married late when they were building something, and women married when the offer came. What I did not like was the sentence she put at the end of it, which was, "He is a serious man, and I am tired of being amusing." She was married in October at her uncle's house. I was not there. It was a day's travel and a hotel night, and I had $4 in the world, and I wrote her a letter instead and told her that I had made a straight line at last and she had better come and see it. She wrote back from Ashcombe, where the mill was, and the letters kept coming for 2 more years, and they were good letters. She wrote about the house, which was brick and had 11 rooms, and a stair with a black walnut rail she said was the only honest thing in it. She wrote about her husband's sister Loretta, who had kept that house for 30 years and had a place for every object in it, including, she said, the new wife. She wrote about her stepson Merritt, who was grown and worked in the counting room and would not look at her, and about her stepdaughter Dovey, who was 13 and would look at nothing else. She said the country was pretty and the winters were long, and the mill made a sound she liked because it reminded her of Rockridge. Then, in the spring of the year her uncle died, the letters changed. They did not stop. That is what I want you to understand. Because when a thing stops, you notice it, and you write, and you ask. They changed, which is a different thing altogether, and which a person can talk themselves out of noticing for a year. They got shorter. They got careful. She stopped telling me the names of people and started saying, the sister, the doctor, the girl in the kitchen. She wrote once that she had found something in the mill books that she did not understand and would take to her uncle's man in Philadelphia when she went down in June. And then in the next letter, she did not mention it, and when I asked, she wrote back about the garden. The last one I had from her that spring was 6 lines long. It said that she had been unwell, that they had had the doctor to her twice, that I was not to worry and not to come. Then, underneath, in a hand that had gone small and cramped, as if she had written it with the paper on her knee and somebody in the room. I am well. Remember that I told you I was well. I read that line and I did nothing about it, and I have had my whole life since to think about what I did instead, which was to write a cheerful letter back about my father's store. In July of that year, a woman I did not know sent me a black bordered card because my name was in Delphine's writing case with the other names, and somebody in that house had been thorough. It said that Delphine Rourke Ames, beloved wife of Junius Ames, had departed this life on the 17th of June in the 27th year of her age, and that the interment had been made on the 19th at the Ashcombe burying ground. It had been sent out 3 weeks after the fact. There was no cause of death on it, because there never was, and there was no letter with it, and there was nothing to answer. I put the card in the tin box with the letters, and I did not open that box again for 3 years. I want to be honest about those 3 years, because a story like this one tempts a person to say that she never rested, that she knew from the first that something was wrong, that she was already gathering herself. That is not what happened. What happened is that my father's store went on dying by inches, and I went on keeping the books of it, and I turned 21 and 22, and a man named Pettibone, who sold agricultural implements, asked me twice to marry him, and I said no twice, and I could not have told anybody why. I got up at 5. I made the fire. I went down and unlocked the store and swept the boards and sold 3 cents worth of pins to a woman who wanted to stand and talk. That is a life. It goes by. The grief settles into it like sediment, and you stop seeing the water move. My father died in the October before I turned 23, in the room over the store, of a thing the doctor called an affection of the heart, and my father called nothing at all, because he would not have it named. He was 61. I sat with him for 9 days, and on the 8th he took hold of my wrist and said, "The ledger is square, Verna. Whatever else, the ledger is square." It was true, and it was almost all he had. After the funeral, I had to go through the store to sell it, and that is a job nobody warns you about, because a store is a man's whole mind laid out on shelves. I found his samples from 30 years back. I found a drawer of buttons he had bought in a lot in the year I was born and never sold one of. And in the back of the letter case, where he kept the paid bills on a spindle and the unpaid ones in a cigar box, I found a letter addressed to me. It was addressed to me at the seminary. That was the first strange thing. It had gone to Rockridge and been forwarded to Bell Furnace, and it had come to the store because the store was the post address for everybody in our family, and my father had put it aside in the cigar box, and there it had sat. He had been ill by then. He had been ill for longer than he let me know. I do not believe he hid it from me. I believe he set it down, meaning to hand it to me at supper, and then his chest took him, and he forgot, and it went under a stack of invoices, and 3 years went over the top of it. I knew the hand before I had it all the way out of the box. My legs went, and I sat down on a nail keg in the back of my dead father's store, with my thumb over the seal, and my ears ringing so loud that the sound of the street outside went far off, like something happening in another building. It was 6 sentences long. It was not signed with her name, only with the 2 initials she had used in my album. And the postmark on the envelope, stamped crooked and rubbed but perfectly plain when I carried it to the window and turned it to the light, was from a town called Redwater, which I had never heard of in my life, and the date on it was the 26th of June. She had been buried on the 19th. I sat on that nail keg until the light went out of the window, and then I lit a lamp and read the 6 sentences again, and I have them by heart the way you have the things that were said to you as a child. They tell me I have been unwell and that I am not to write letters. I am not unwell. I am writing this one on the flyleaf of a hymn book, and a girl is carrying it out under her apron, and I have given her my garnet ring for it. Do not write to the house. Do not write to me at all, because there is nowhere for a letter to come. Yours till the mill wheel stops. There was no place name at the top and no date on the sheet. There was the smudged postmark on the envelope, Redwater, and the 26th of June, and there was a woman lying under a stone at Ashcombe since the 19th with that same name cut into it. I want to tell you what I thought first, because it was not the truth. What I thought first was that the letter had been written before she died and carried out late by whoever the girl was, and that the postmark meant nothing but a servant's slowness. I sat there and built that explanation and put a roof on it, and it stood for about 4 minutes, and then it fell down because of one word: nowhere. There is nowhere for a letter to come. A woman lying ill in her own bedroom in her own brick house has an address. She has the best address in the county. Only a woman who is being kept somewhere that is not spoken of has nowhere for a letter to come. The next morning, I walked down to the post office at Bell Furnace, which was a window in the back of the harness shop, and I asked Mr. Dreisbach whether he had ever heard of a town called Redwater. He put on his spectacles and got down the postal guide and ran his finger along it and said that there was a Redwater in Sadler County, up in the hills, a station on the branch line with a creamery and not much else, and that it was, he judged, better than 30 miles above Ashcombe. Then he looked at me over the spectacles and said, "You have gone the color of that wall, Verna." I did the honest thing first. I want that on the record, because of what I did afterward. I went home and I wrote a plain letter to Mr. Junius Ames of Ashcombe, and I signed it with my own name, and I said in it that I had been a friend of his wife's from her school years, that I had lately come into a letter of hers that had been delayed, and that I would take it as a kindness if he would tell me something of her last illness, as I had never been told anything at all. It was a mild letter. I read it over twice to be sure there was nothing in it that could be taken for an accusation, because there was nothing in me yet that was an accusation. I still thought there might be a sad, ordinary answer, and that a woman had gone out of her mind with grief for her uncle, and had been sent somewhere quiet, and had died there, and that a proud family had told the county she died at home. The answer came in 11 days, and it was not from him. It was written on gray paper with a black border still, 3 years after, which I noticed even then. It said, "Madam, Mr. Ames is not able to enter into correspondence upon this subject, and I write for him." Mrs. Ames died in June of the year '84 after a long decline. The family does not discuss it, and would take it as a favor if the matter were allowed to rest. Yours, L. Ames. I read that 4 times. Then I got up and walked out the back of the store and stood in the yard in the November cold without a shawl until my teeth were going, because I had to get my face in order before I came back in. It was not the refusal. People refuse. It was the phrase, "a long decline," sitting there in that flat hand, when the black-bordered card had told me she departed this life on the 17th of June with no cause at all, and when the woman herself had written me in the spring that she had had the doctor twice and that I was not to worry. A long decline is what you say about a woman who has been dying for a year in a front bedroom with the shades drawn. Somebody had chosen those 3 words. Somebody had chosen them in 1884 and had them ready in 1886, ready enough to write them out to a stranger in 11 days without troubling the man of the house about it at all. And it was signed L. Ames, the sister, not the widower. 3 years after his wife was in the ground, a letter comes to his house asking about her, and it never reaches his hands. That was the night I stopped grieving and started counting. I sold the store in December to a man named Orland Shupp, who wanted the fixtures more than the trade. And when the lawyer had taken his part and the creditors theirs, I had $240, a trunk with brass corners, my mother's rings, and a tin box. I was 22 years old, and there was not one living soul on this earth who needed me anywhere on any particular day. I have thought since that this is the most dangerous condition a person can be in, and also the only one in which a thing like what I did is possible. My mother had a second cousin in Ashcombe, a widow named Ottilie Vandegrift, who kept a boarding house on Canal Street. 11 rooms and a bad furnace and 9 boarders, most of them from the mill. We had exchanged Christmas letters my whole life and met exactly twice. I wrote and told her that my father was dead, that the store was sold, that I could keep books and do plain sewing, and that I would come and work for my board if she had a corner. She wrote back by return post that she had been trying to keep accounts on the backs of envelopes since her husband died, and that I should come before she was taken up for fraud. I got off the train at Ashcombe on the 9th of January in a wind that came straight down the creek, and the first thing I saw, before the town, before the depot, before anything, was the mill. It stood in the bend of the Wissahick, with the water black around the wheelhouse, and the stone of it stained down the sides. 4 stories, and a bell cupola, and a stack going up behind for the steam engine they used when the creek was low. Every window was lit, because it was 4:30 in the afternoon in January, and the girls were at the looms. You could hear it from the platform, not the machines separately, but the whole building, one low sound, under the wind, under the horses, under the man calling out the baggage. It went through the boards of the platform and up through my shoes. Yours till the mill wheel stops, I thought, standing there with my trunk at my feet. Well, it has not stopped. I want to say plainly what my intention was on that platform, because I have been asked it since by a judge, by a newspaper, and by my own conscience at 3 in the morning for the rest of my life. I did not go to Ashcombe to marry Junius Ames. I had no such idea. I went to find out where a woman had been in June of 1884, and what was done with her. And I meant to do it the way a person of no importance does anything, which is slowly, by sitting in kitchens and listening. That part was easier than I expected. A boarding house is the best listening post in any town because working people come home tired and talk to whoever is at the table, and a quiet young woman with a pen and a column of figures is furniture. Here is what the town of Ashcombe knew about the death of the second Mrs. Ames, and I got it in pieces over 5 weeks, and no 2 pieces fit. Mrs. Vandegrift herself said the poor thing had fallen on the mill office stair, which was iron and steep, and had been the ruin of 2 men before her, and had lingered a day and died. A weaver named Hesse Prahl, who boarded on the 3rd floor and had been 11 years in the finishing room, said no, that was old Emmett Doyle who fell on the stair, and Mrs. Ames had never been near the mill in her life but the once, at the picnic. A drayman said she had gone consumptive, and that they had sent her to the seashore, and she had died there and been brought home, which at least had a railway car in it, and was the closest anyone came. And a woman who did the Ames washing before the family took a girl in the house said, with her mouth pulled small, that Mrs. Ames had gone off her head after her uncle died, and had been strange with the little girl Dovey, and that the family had borne it very patiently, and that it was a mercy at the last. Off her head. That one was in the town like a nail in a board. I heard it 4 separate times in 5 weeks from 4 people who had never been inside that house, and every time it came with the same little softening afterward, the same, they bore it very patiently, until I understood that I was not hearing 4 opinions. I was hearing one opinion, laid down carefully 3 years before, by somebody with the standing to lay it, and repeated ever since by people who thought they had come to it themselves. I saw Junius Ames for the first time on a Sunday in February in the Presbyterian Church on Bell Street, from 4 pews back. He was a big man gone heavy, in a good black coat, with a gray beard cut close, and a neck that had thickened over his collar. He sang without looking at the book. He put a folded bill in the plate and not a coin. And twice during the sermon, while the minister was on the subject of the household of faith, he turned his head slightly toward the window, and I saw his jaw work, and I thought, with no evidence at all and with complete certainty, there is a man who is not asleep at night. In the pew with him were 3 people. A young man of about 26, dark, narrow through the face, who sat forward with his elbows on his knees like a man waiting for a train. A girl of 16 or so in a hat too old for her, who looked at everything and everybody, including me, twice. And on the aisle, a woman of about 60 in dove gray, upright as a fence post, with white hair parted in the exact center of her head and a jet brooch at her throat, and her gloved hands folded on a hymn book she did not open. I did not have to be told which was which. When the service let out, she went down the aisle first, and the other 3 came behind her. Ottilie Vandegrift told me the rest over the supper dishes. The young man was Merritt, the son by the first wife, who ran the counting room and had not spoken to his father except on business in 2 years, and nobody knew why. The girl was Dovey, 17 this coming June, kept close, and the woman in gray was Miss Loretta Ames, who had come to that house at 28 when her brother's first wife died in childbed, and had run it for 30 years, and ran the Ladies' Aid and the Cemetery Association, and, said Mrs. Vandegrift, dropping her voice out of pure habit, though there was nobody in the kitchen but us, about half the county without anybody noticing that she did it. And there is talk this winter, she said, wringing out the cloth, that he means to marry again. 3rd time. There is a widow in Redwater the doctor has been mentioning to him. The plate I was drawing did not break. I have always been glad of that. But my hands went so cold so fast that I had to set it down in the rack and put them flat on the table. And Mrs. Vandegrift said, was I taking a chill? And I said it was the draft from the entry. A widow in Redwater. The doctor has been mentioning her. I did not sleep that night, and I did not pray about it either, which I ought to have. I lay in the little room under the eaves, with the mill sound coming up the valley, and I thought about the 11 rooms and the black walnut rail, and the room where her things must be, if her things were anywhere, and the keys on the ring at that woman's waist. I thought, everything I need is inside that house, and there is exactly 1 door into it, and a man is standing in that doorway looking for a wife. By morning I had decided, and I have never been able to make myself sorry for it, only afraid of it. It took 9 weeks, and it took less arranging than you would think, which tells you something about how those things were done. Mrs. Vandegrift was on the Ladies' Aid. I went with her. I was quiet, I was quick with figures, I was 23 years old, and not pretty in the way that makes women uneasy, and I could cut a lining. At the March sewing meeting, Miss Loretta Ames asked me to hold a hank of yarn for her winding, and asked me my father's business and my mother's people, and whether I had been schooled. At home, ma'am, I said. My father taught me the books. That was the lie. It was the first one, and it was the whole hinge of the thing, and I told it to her over a hank of gray yarn, with my hands out in front of me like a girl in a picture, and my voice did not change at all. I had a brass-cornered album at the bottom of my trunk with her sister-in-law's handwriting in it, and I had a tin box with 51 letters, and from that afternoon on, I never once said the word Rockridge in the county of Sadler. He called at the boarding house the second week of April, in the front parlor, with his hat in his hands, and Mrs. Vandergrift making a great deal of noise in the hall to prove she was not listening. He was not a fool, and he did not pretend to feelings he did not have. He said that he was 51 years of age, that he had buried 2 wives, that his house wanted a mistress, and his daughter wanted a woman in it who was nearer her own years than her aunt, and that he was told I was steady and could keep an account. He said his affairs were sound. He said he would be plain with me, and he hoped I would be plain with him. Then he turned his hat around once in his hands and said, "I am a serious man, Miss Kelso. I have no talent for being amusing." I have been asked how I answered him. What I actually did, for the space of about 3 seconds, was stand very still while the floor tipped, because I had read those words before in a letter written by a girl of 24 from her uncle's house on Rourke Street, and I understood in that moment that he had said them to her too, in the same room he had them ready in, the way a man has one good story he tells at every dinner. I said yes on the 28th of April. We were married on the 12th of May in the front room of the brick house on Bell Street by the Presbyterian minister, with 9 people present. Merritt Ames was not one of them. Miss Loretta stood at her brother's left hand in dove gray and put her cheek against mine afterward, dry as paper, and said, "You will find that everything in this house has a place, my dear. It saves so much thinking." That night, I walked up the black walnut stair as Mrs. Ames, the third of that name, with a lamp in my hand and my husband's step behind me. And at the top, I turned and looked down the upper hall, and I counted the doors. There were 5. 4 of them stood open on dark rooms. The 5th, at the end, had a keyhole with no key in it, and there was no strip of dust along the bottom of that door, and there is only one way a door gets no dust under it, and that is if somebody opens it. A house tells you what it is in the first week, if you will stop trying to be liked long enough to listen. The Ames house had 11 rooms, and it ran like a mill. The kitchen fire was lit at 4:30 by Clemmy Doak, who had come there as a girl of 15 and was now 40, and had a way of moving through a room without displacing the air in it. Breakfast was at 7, and it was on the table at 7, not 2 minutes after. Mr. Ames left for the mill at past. The gas was lit in the hall at dusk and turned down at 9 and out at 10, and if you were reading, you finished by candle, or you did not read. On Monday the wash, on Tuesday the ironing and the silver, on Wednesday the ladies' aid, on Thursday the accounts, on Friday the marketing and the baking, on Saturday the floors and the boots and the bath water carried up, and on Sunday the church and the cold dinner and the long dead afternoon. And at the middle of it, from 4:30 in the morning until 10 at night, in dove gray or in black, with a ring of keys on a chatelaine hook at her waist that chimed a little when she turned, my husband's sister. I have known hard women. My grandmother Kelso was a hard woman, and would tell you so before you found it out. Loretta Ames was not hard. That is what took me so long. She was pleasant. She was tireless. She inquired after your head if you touched it. She remembered which of the mill girls had a sick mother and sent broth. She never raised her voice one time in the 5 months I lived under her hand. She had come to that house at 28 when her brother's first wife died in the bearing of Merritt, and she had washed that baby and buried that woman and taken the keys, and in 30 years she had not once given them up. The first morning I came down and went to the sideboard to pour, and she was there before me with her hand already on the pot, and she smiled and said, "I have always poured. It is nothing to me either way, my dear." And she poured. And that was the whole of it. There was no place in the world to put a complaint about a woman pouring coffee, and she knew that. And I did not understand for a month that this is how it is done. Not one large refusal you can name and fight. 400 small ones a week, each of them too small to mention without looking like a fool, until you find that in your own house you do not know where the good scissors are kept. Merritt would not look at me. At table he answered his father in figures, and me in one word, and his aunt not at all, and he was gone up the mill road by the time the plates were cleared. Dovey looked at me all the time. She was a long-legged girl of not quite 17, with her mother's chin, hemmed in by a woman of 60, and a father who did not know what to say to her. And she wanted, in the way a starved thing wants, someone in that house who was under 40. She came into my room on the 4th evening on the excuse of a hook and eye and stayed an hour and a half. And my husband. I have to tell you about my husband, and it is the part of this I have never told well. He was not cruel to me. I have to say it in that order because for a long time I could not say it at all. He was courteous and heavy and quiet and awkward with me in a way that would have been touching in a younger man. He asked me every evening how the day had gone, and he listened to the answer. He gave me $40 the first of every month for the house and never once asked for an accounting, which I thought at first was generosity and understood later was something else. He slept badly. 2 or 3 nights a week I would wake and find the bed cold beside me and hear him down in the front room, not walking, just sitting. And once I came out on the landing in my wrapper and looked over the rail, and he was in the dark with no lamp lit at all, in the chair by the cold grate, with his hands on his knees, facing the front window. I stood up there and looked down at the top of my husband's head in the dark and thought, you know something, and you carry it at night, and in the daytime you eat your supper. It did not make me pity him. It made me careful, the way you are careful on ice that has water showing at the edges. Now, in the whole of my first month in that house, not one person said her name. I do not mean that they avoided the subject when I raised it. I mean that in a house where a woman had lived for 3 years as its mistress, she had been taken out of the fabric as neatly as a wrong thread. There was no photograph of her in the parlor, and there were 9 photographs in that parlor, including 2 of the first wife with her hair in the style of 30 years back. There was no mourning card in the Bible, and the Bible had 11 of them in it. There was no dress of hers in the presses, no hairbrush of hers pushed to the back of a drawer, no book with her name on the flyleaf on the shelf in the front room. In a house where nothing was ever thrown away, where I found a box of dead men's collars in the linen room, and a fire screen with a hole burned in it kept for 30 years because it had belonged to somebody's aunt, there was not one object belonging to Delphine Rourke. That is not grief. I know what grief looks like in a house. When my mother died, my father kept her shawl over the back of the chair for 2 years and would not let it be moved, and did not speak of it once. Grief keeps. What I was standing in was not keeping. It was a cleaning. The first crack came from the girl. We were in the dining room the last week of May, doing the ironing between us because Clemmie's wrist was bad, and Dovey was talking about a picnic, and I was half listening, and she said, without any particular weight on it, "That was her chair you sit in." The iron stopped in my hand. I put it back on the stand and turned it up on its heel the way you do. "Whose, Dovey?" "Delphine's." She said it fast and small and then looked at the door. That look told me more than the sentence had. "You are not to say her name in this house," I said. It was not a question, and I did not put it as one. and I said it in a level tone, as if I were reciting a rule I had already been taught, and I watched the girl's face come apart with relief that somebody else in the world knew the rule and was not going to punish her for it. Aunt Loretta says it upsets Papa. She pushed her hair back with her wrist, the way you do when your hands are hot. It does upset him. I said it once at Christmas, and he went out to the barn. Then she picked up the sprinkling bottle and did not look at me and said, "She used to plait my hair. She was the only one who could do it without pulling." I did not push her. That is the single wisest thing I did that entire spring. I said, "Then she must have had a light hand." And I took up the iron again, and we did 4 more pillow slips. And at the end of it, Dovey said to the ironing board, "I have got something of hers. Aunt does not know." "Then do not tell me," I said, "not yet." She looked up at me quick, and something went between us across that board, and it was the first honest thing that had happened to me in that house. 2 evenings after that, I did the foolish thing. I have gone back over it 100 times, and I cannot make myself believe I could have done otherwise, but it cost me 6 weeks. Junius and I were alone in the front room. He had the county paper, and I had my mending, and the gas was going, and it was raining, and there was that lull that comes at about 9 when a house has stopped moving. And I said, in the mildest voice I own, "Junius, will you tell me about your second wife?" He did not put the paper down. He read on for about the length of 4 breaths, and I could see the print was not going into him at all. And then he folded it, once, twice, carefully, along the folds it already had, and laid it on the table beside the lamp. "Why?" he said. "Because I am living in her house," I said, "and I sit in her chair, and I would rather be told the truth by you than a piece of it by somebody else in the street." He put his hands on his knees. The fire was not lit, it being May, and there was that black grate. He looked at it. "Delphine was 30 when she died," he said at last. "She was not 30, she was 7 and 20. I have got in the way of saying 30 because it was said to me." He stopped, and I did not fill it. "She was a fine-looking woman, and quicker than anybody in this county, and she came to a bad end, and it was in this family, and I have got nothing to give you about it that will do you any good." "You could give me the truth of it." "The truth of it," he said, and he laughed one time, without any humor in it whatever, the sound a man makes when a door catches his finger. "The truth of it is a paper with my name signed at the bottom, and I have had 3 years of it, and it does not improve." Then he got up. He was a big man, and he came up out of that chair heavily, and he stood there and he said, in a voice that had gone rough at the edges, "Do not ask me again, Verna. I will not have it in the evenings. It is the only time I get." He went out to the barn. That is where he went, exactly as Dovey had said. And I sat there with the mending in my lap and my heart going in my throat and not in my chest at all, saying over to myself, "A paper with my name signed at the bottom, not a grave, not a fever, not a fall, a paper." The next morning at 8 o'clock, Loretta Ames came into the still room where I was doing the strawberries and shut the door behind her, which I had never seen her do, and stood with her hands folded at her waist and the keys hanging quiet. "My brother did not sleep," she said. "I am sorry for it." "You will be sorrier if it goes on." She said it kindly. That is the thing I want you to hear. She said it exactly as she would have told me not to give Dovey sweets before bed. I do not know what they told you in that boarding house, and I dare say it was a great deal, and none of it accurate. He was very ill after. He was ill in a way that a woman of your years has not seen and does not want to see. He came through it, and he has his mill and his children, and now he has a wife, and he is to be let alone." She came a step nearer and looked down into the pan at the berries, and moved 2 of them with 1 finger, and said, "You are a sensible girl, Verna. That is what recommended you to me. Be sensible about this, and you and I will do very well." "Yes, Miss Ames." "Loretta," she said and smiled and went out, and I stood over that pan with my hands in the juice, and I understood 2 things at once. The first was that she had said what they told you in that boarding house, and I had never told a living soul in that house which boarding house, though of course she knew, and she was letting me know that she knew. The second was the word recommended. Recommended to me, not to him. I had not been chosen by my husband. I had been passed on approval, by her, like a length of goods. The doctor came on the 9th of June. His name was Orrin Spite, and he was the Ames family doctor, and had been for 20 years, a smooth pink man of 60, with very clean hands and a gold chain, and he came, said Loretta, only to see how the new Mrs. Ames did in the heat, as she had come from a low country and might feel our air. He sat with me in the back parlor for 3/4 of an hour with his hat on his knee. He asked whether I slept. He asked whether I had headaches, and whether my mother had been nervous, and whether I had ever been troubled by low spirits or by fancies. He asked twice, in 2 different ways, whether I ever felt that I was watched or spoken of. He asked whether I had been happy in my father's house. I answered everything the way a dull woman answers, and I made my hands lie still in my lap. And when he was gone, I went upstairs and was sick in the basin, quietly, with the door shut and the water running out of the pitcher to cover it. Because I had heard that catechism before, not with my ears, in a letter, from a boarding house table, from a washerwoman with her mouth pulled small. She went off her head after her uncle died. Somebody had had to go around and say it. And before somebody said it in the street, somebody with a gold chain and clean hands had to sit in a back parlor with his hat on his knee and ask a woman whether she ever felt she was watched. They had a machine in that house. I had just heard it turn over once, on me. It was the heat that gave me the attic. And I have thought since that if that June had been a cool one, none of this would ever have come out. The last week of the month, it went up over 90 and stayed. And the summer things had to come down. And Clemmie's wrist was still bad. And Loretta went to Redwater on the Thursday for the Creamery Association, which was the only day in 5 months that she left the county. Dovey was at her music. I said I would do the attic, and nobody thought about it twice, because it was hot work and nobody wants it. The stair to that attic was behind a door at the end of the upper hall, and it was narrow and it turned, and the heat came down it like the breath out of an oven. It smelled of dust and hot slate and camphor and the sour, dry smell of old newspaper. There was one window at the gable end, so filmed over that the light came through it yellow. There were the bins of summer things. There were 3 broken chairs and a dressmaker's form and a wooden case of jars and the first Mrs. Ames's spinning wheel with the band off it and boxes and boxes and boxes. And in the far corner, under a folded carpet with a hat box on top of it, a trunk. It was a good trunk, better than mine, canvas over wood with brass at the corners, and on the end of it, in black paint gone gray, 3 letters, D-R-A. I stood and looked at it for a long time. It is a strange thing about the body, that it will tell you a thing is important before your mind has agreed to it. My hands had gone cold in that 100-degree attic. I could hear my own breath, and there was a voice in me being very reasonable, saying that a family keeps a dead woman's trunk in the attic, that this is the most ordinary thing in the world, that here at last was the plain explanation. They had not destroyed her. They had put her away like everybody puts things away. I moved the hat box. I took the carpet off. I put my thumbs under the lid. It was not locked. The smell that came up out of it was camphor and cedar and something underneath, faint, that stopped my hands where they were, because it was violet water, and it was hers, and I was 14 years old in a cold stairwell at Rockridge with a candle going by. On the top was a shawl, gray silk, folded. Under that, a black dress, good, hardly worn. Under that, 2 more dresses, a wool and a print, and a pair of house slippers with the heels gone down, and a bundle of collars, and a writing case with nothing in it at all, not one sheet, not a nib, not a scrap. And that emptiness was the first thing in that trunk that was wrong, because I have never in my life opened a woman's writing case and found nothing in it. Then, in the bottom, wrapped in a piece of unbleached muslin, 2 things. The first was a hymn book. It was a cheap one, cloth over boards, black, the kind bought by the gross for a chapel, worn at the corners in a way her good things never were. I opened it and the fly-leaf was gone. Not torn out in a hurry either. It had been cut, close into the binding, with a straight edge, by somebody who took their time and did not want the stub to show. I sat down on the attic floor in the dust with that book in my lap, and I put my hand over my mouth and I made no sound at all. Because 2 rooms below me, Clemmy Doak was scalding jars, and because I had a letter in a tin box in my trunk that was written on a fly-leaf, and because a woman does not cut a page out of a hymn book in her own bedroom in her own brick house. She does it where there is no other paper. The second thing in the muslin was a nightgown, plain cotton, mended twice at the elbow by a hand that was not hers, because Delphine Rourke could not mend and was proud of it. And on the inside of the collar band, in indelible ink, in a firm, clerkly hand that had written the same thing a great many times before, were 2 letters and a number. AR 14. I did not know what it meant. I want to be exact, because everything after this is what I did knowing, and I did not know yet. I sat on that floor in the yellow light with the sweat running down my back, and I turned that collar band to the window, and I thought only, that is not a laundry mark from this house. Clemmy marks in cross-stitch. I have seen the sheets. And then, from the yard below, through the open gable window, I heard the gate and the sound of a horse being pulled up, and Loretta Ames's voice saying something to Sim Bracey about the near shoe, 4 hours before she was expected home. There is a kind of thinking that happens faster than thinking, and I did all of mine in the time it took a woman downstairs to get out of a buggy. I put the nightgown and the hymn book inside the bib of my apron and pulled the apron string up tight under my arms. I put the collars back and the slippers and the writing case and the print dress and the wool and the black and the gray silk shawl folded the way it had been folded, which was in thirds, and I know it was in thirds because I made myself look at it before I moved it, and that is the one habit out of my father's store that saved me in that house. Put it back the way it lay. I shut the lid, I set the hat box on it at the angle it had been at, with the paper label turned toward the wall. I dragged the carpet over and shook it out and let it fall the way a folded carpet falls. Then I took the topmost bin of summer things, and I went down that stair with it held in front of me at the height of my chest, which is where a bin naturally rides, and which is also, if you are carrying 2 objects inside your apron, exactly where you want a bin to be. She was standing at the bottom of the attic stair. I had not heard her on the hall carpet, and I never once did, in 5 months, hear that woman come. She had her bonnet still on, and her gloves in her left hand, and she was looking up into that dark, hot stairway with her head a little to one side. And when the bin came down into the light, she did not move out of the way of it. "You are in the attic," she said. "The summer things." I let the bin come down onto my hip, and I put the back of my wrist to my forehead, which was not acting, because the sweat was running off me. "It is 100 degrees up there, Loretta. Clemmie's wrist would never have stood it." She looked at me for what I have always counted since as 4 seconds. There is no explaining what those 4 seconds were like. Her eyes went over my face and down to the bin and back, and there was nothing in them at all. No suspicion, no anger, nothing you could take hold of, and that was the worst of it. It was the look a woman gives a length of goods she is deciding about. "There is a great deal up there that has no business being kept," she said. "I have been meaning to have it out for years, and I never find the day." "Shall I go through it for you?" I said. "I have got the time." And she smiled at me with real warmth and said, "How good you are. No, my dear, there is nothing up there but rubbish and my father's papers, and I should not know myself if I could not put my hand on my own rubbish." Then she went down to see about the near shoe, and I carried that bin into the sewing room and set it down and stood over it with my hands flat on the lid until they stopped. 4 days later, I went up on an errand of my own making with a candle at 2 in the afternoon, and the carpet was folded in the corner, and the hat box was on the floor, and the trunk was gone. That night, when the house was down and my husband was asleep with his arm over his eyes the way he slept, I took the lamp into the little back room where I did the mending, and I shut the door, and I got out the tin box. The letter had been in it 3 years and 8 months by then. I had read it so many times that the folds were soft as cloth, and one of them was starting to go through. I laid it flat on the table, and I put the hymn book beside it, and I opened the front cover and turned it back. Where the fly-leaf had been, there was a stub about 1/8 of an inch wide, still bound in, the way there always is. The cut was clean, and it was straight for its whole length, except at the very bottom, in the last inch, where the knife or the scissors had gone off a little and taken a small bite out toward the binding, so that the stub there was narrower, in a shape like the corner of a step. I turned my letter over and set its bound edge against that stub. It fit. Not near enough. It fit the way a key fits, the way the 2 halves of a torn ticket fit, the little step in the cut on the letter standing up into the little bite in the stub, and the paper the same yellowish laid stock, and the ruling of the chapel binding showing at the edge of both. I sat there with the lamp turned low and my 2 hands flat on the table on either side of that book, and I found that I was rocking, a little, forward and back, the way women do at a graveside, and that there were tears going down my face and off my chin onto the table, and I had not known that any of it had started. It was not the proof. I want to be honest about that, because it was not proof of anything a court would look at, and I knew it even then. It was that she had been alive. That was all. For 3 years and 8 months, I had carried a dead woman and a wrong postmark, and I had told myself a dozen times that grief makes people clever at finding meanings, and that a smudged date on an envelope is a thin thing to build a life on, and that I had married a man on the strength of an ink stamp. And now there was a black cloth hymn book from a chapel that is not the Presbyterian Church on Bell Street. out of a trunk with her initials on it, with a page cut out of it by somebody with time and no other paper. And I had the page. She had sat somewhere. She had cut that leaf. She had written 6 sentences on it and given a garnet ring to a girl to carry it out under an apron. And a week later, this county buried her. I put my head down on my arms on the table, and I said her name out loud, twice, in that house, for the first time. Then I dried my face, and I put the letter and the hymn book back in the tin box, and the tin box back inside the lining of my trunk. And I sat up the rest of that night and worked out what a person with no money, no standing, no lawyer, and no name of her own actually has. And the answer was 3 things: registers, servants, books of account. The burying ground at Ashcombe was on the hill above the Presbyterian church, and I had been to it twice with the family on a Sunday, and had never once been taken to the Ames plot, which I had thought at the time was delicacy. I went up on my own on a Tuesday morning in July with a basket, as if for the flowers on the bank, and I found the plot inside its low iron rail. The first Mrs. Ames, Susanna, born 1831, died 1861, with a lamb on the stone. 2 Ames infants, the old people, and at the end, newest, the stone still with a hard, clean edge, a small, plain marble. Delphine, wife of Junius Ames, died June the 17th, 1884, aged 27 years. No text, no verse, not one word of Rourke on it, when she had been a Rourke for 24 years and an Ames for less than 3, and her uncle had paid for her schooling, and her mourning was still going on in a house on Front Street in Philadelphia, for all anybody in Ashcombe knew or cared. The grass on it was in good order, because the Cemetery Association kept the whole ground in good order, and the association was run by Miss Loretta Ames. The rector's register was kept in the vestry in a japanned box, and Mr. Cadwallader Peel, who had come to that parish in 1885 and had not been there when any of it happened, was the easiest man in the county to get a thing out of, because he was 59 years old and lonely, and dearly loved to be asked a question he could answer out of a book. I told him I was making up the family dates for the family Bible, which any third wife might do, and he was delighted, and he got out the register and licked his thumb and turned the leaves back, and we did the first Mrs. Ames and the infants, and then he came to it and turned the book around so I could see, and put his finger under the line and read it out to me in his pulpit voice. Delphine R. Ames, burial, June the 19th, 1884. Officiating the Reverend Josiah Truhitt. And then, in the column at the right, in the same hand, small, Certificate of O. Spite, M.D., remains conveyed from Redwater. Coffin not opened, by direction. I looked at that line for as long as I dared, and then I said, in the voice of a woman making conversation, "Redwater, was she taken ill away from home then?" "That I could not tell you," said Mr. Peel comfortably. "It was before my time. Mr. Truitt had the parish then, and he is gone to his reward. It is not unusual, you know, where there has been a long illness to have the interment ordered so. Sometimes it is the wish of the family, and sometimes it is the wish of the physician." He shut the book with a soft clap and beamed at me. "You will find the Ames family very careful of forms. Miss Ames revised the whole register herself in '85 when the damp got into the box. A most public-spirited woman. I went home and made an apple butter and did not remember doing it. Sim Bracey was 70 or near it and had had the Ames stable since the war. and he was deaf in the left ear and did not care one straw for anybody in that house, which in my experience is the most useful combination a witness can have. I took him a cup of coffee out to the stable on the Thursday because Loretta was at the aid, and Clemmy was at the market, and Dovey was at her music. And I sat down on the corn bin like a farm girl and asked him about the horses, and we were 20 minutes on the horses. Then I said, "Sim, were you here when Mr. Ames's second wife was brought home?" He took his time. He drank about half that coffee and looked out the stable door at the yard. "I met the train," he said, "with the wagon. With the spring wagon. Mr. Rupp's hearse was at the church, and I was to bring the box up from the depot and go around by the hill and not by Bell Street." He turned the cup in his hands. "Two of the mill hands come with me to lift. And Mr. Ames." Mr. Ames was at the house. Miss Loretta was at the depot. Miss Loretta signed the paper for the railroad. He drank the rest of it. "I have thought about that box since. I will say that to you, and I will not say it in the street." I sat still on the corn bin, and I made my voice come out flat. "Say it to me." "It was light," said Sim Bracey. "There was 4 of us to it, and it come up off that baggage truck like a box of empty crates. I have carried a good many. My own wife I carried. There was a man at the mill went into the picker, and we carried what there was of him, and that was a bad load, and it was heavier than that box." He set the cup down on the bin beside me. "I said something to one of the hands, and Miss Loretta heard me say it, and she come around the end of the wagon, and she says, 'The poor thing wasted to nothing, Sim, and don't you speak of it before my brother.' And she looked at me." He shrugged one shoulder. "I liked my place. I was 56-year-old. I have thought since about how many people that woman did that to. Not one of them was bought. That is what I have never been able to make anybody understand who did not live there. She did not pay for a single silence in 3 years. She simply stood at the end of a wagon and told a man what he had seen, in a kind voice, and he was 56 years old and had a place, and so he had seen it. Now, the accounts. The household $40 came to me the first of the month, and I kept it in a book, because that is what I am. And by August, I had the marketing down 11%, and Clemmy thought I was a witch. But the household book was a puddle. The lake was at the mill, in the counting room over the office, and the counting room was Merritt's. He had spoken perhaps 200 words to me since May. So I went at it the only honest way I had, which was to be useful, and on a Saturday in the middle of August, I walked the mill road with the dinner pail his aunt sent up, and instead of leaving it on the desk and going, I said, "Mr. Ames, if I am to run that house properly, I ought to understand what it costs and where it comes from, and I do not, and your aunt tells me it is not a thing I need trouble about. I would rather be troubled. Will you show me the way the books go?" He looked up at me for a good long moment. He had ink on the side of his hand, and his father's heavy shoulders on a narrow frame, and he was 26, and I had never once been alone in a room with him. "She tells me the same thing," he said. He showed me the books. He showed me the whole run of them, out of what I understood much later was 3 years of a young man's stored up and perfectly useless anger. Sitting on a high stool with his coat off, turning the great pages, and I stood at his elbow in the smell of ink and wool grease and machine oil, with my hands behind my back, and asked the sort of small, stupid questions that let a man show off, and remembered everything. The mill was not sound. It was not near sound. It had a mortgage on it of $31,000, and the wool was bought at a price, and the goods were selling at a price that did not leave enough between them, because there were 2 new mills on the Schuylkill with newer looms doing the same weight of cloth. He said his father would not hear of it. He said his father had not looked at a ledger in 10 years, that his father walked the floors and knew every hand by name and could smell a bad batch of dye at 40 feet and could not tell you within $8,000 what he owed. Then who can? I said. My aunt, said Merritt Ames. He said it to the page. He turned 2 more leaves and squared them with his fingers and did not look at me. The mill book is mine. The house book and the private book are hers. She brings me the sheets at the quarter, and I enter what she brings, and I foot it. And I have asked twice for the vouchers behind them, once when I was 3 and 20, and once at Christmas of '85. And I have got the same answer both times, which is that my father wishes it so. He shut the ledger. You may draw your own conclusions about a man of 26 who takes that answer, Mrs. Ames. I have drawn mine. Show me the sheets, I said. There was a long silence in that room. The looms were going below us, and the floor came up through my feet, and the window was open, and you could hear the water at the wheelhouse under it all. Then he got down off the stool and went to the press and brought out a bundle of quarterly sheets on a string and laid them on the desk and stood back with his arms folded, like a man who has decided something and is already afraid of it. They were in her hand, small, upright, perfectly even, the same hand as the gray-bordered letter that had come to Bell Furnace in November. Insurance, taxes, the pew rent, coal, the doctor, quarterly $25, which was a great deal for a family that was never sick. Charities, itemized to the cent, the aid, the mission, the ground at the cemetery, repairs. And on the sheet for the September quarter of 1884, and again for December, and again for March of '85, and in every single quarter from that day forward, without one break, at the bottom of the repairs, in the same even hand, Ardsley, $40. I put my finger on it, and I made myself keep my voice in the middle of my chest. What is Ardsley? Merritt leaned over and looked where my finger was and said, easily, the way a man says a thing he has said before, It is a property. My grandfather had 2 houses at Redwater, and one of them is let. There is always something wanting doing to it. $40 a quarter for 3 years is $480, I said, on a let house at Redwater. He did not answer that for a moment. Then he took the sheet out from under my hand and turned it to the light and went along the column with his thumbnail, quarter after quarter, and I watched the color go out from under the skin of a young man's face for the first time in my life. It is the same figure, he said. Every quarter. It never varies. He set it down. Repairs vary. I did not sleep that night. I lay beside my husband and looked at the ceiling and said the 2 things over to each other until they locked. A.R. 14. In indelible ink on the inside of a collar band, in a clerk's hand that had written it a great many times before. Ardsley, $40, every quarter, never varying, since the September after they buried her. On the Monday, I went to the office of the Sadler County Enterprise on the excuse of an advertisement for a girl. And while the boy was setting up my 3 lines, I asked whether they kept the Philadelphia papers, and he said they kept the ledger for the market prices, and there was a heap of them in the back if I liked. I sat on an upturned crate in that back room for an hour and a half in the dust and the smell of ink, and turned the advertising columns of a year of somebody else's newspaper. It was in the 3rd column of a Saturday in April, 1884, in among the boarding schools and the water cures and the trusses. The Ardsley Retreat, established 1852, for the care and treatment of the insane and of persons of unsound or enfeebled mind. Beautifully situated in the hills of Sadler County, 1 mile from Redwater Station. Strictly private. Ladies' wing separate. Terms upon application to the superintendent. $40 a quarter is $160 a year, and $160 a year in 1887 is the keep of one person. I went up to Redwater on the 24th of August, on the branch line, on the excuse of a wool sample for a coverlet, and it cost me $1.10 and the whole of my nerve. The branch runs up the Wissahick and then leaves it and climbs, and the last 4 miles are in the hills, with the woods coming down to the cut on both sides. Redwater is a creamery, a store, a hotel that is a house with a sign on it, and a station platform with one bench. I asked the man at the store, and he took me out and pointed up the road with his pipe. You could not see the house from the road. You could see the wall, and a gate of iron with a lodge beside it, and a drive going up between chestnuts, and above the trees a slate roof with cupolas on it, 3 stories and 1 great chimney. It was a handsome place. That is the thing nobody expects. It sat in mown grass on the shoulder of a hill with the light on it, and if you had told a stranger it was a summer hotel, he would have believed you until he came up close to the gate and saw that the iron was 10 feet high, and that the windows in the west wing had a fine wire mesh let into the sashes, painted the same color as the frames, so that from a little way off you would never see it at all. I walked up that drive and my legs did not want to do it. The clerk in the office was a young man of 30 with a very clean collar and the manner they teach them. I said that I was making an inquiry after a lady who I believed was, or had been, under their care. He said certainly, and dipped his pen and asked the name. Mrs. Delphine Ames, I said, of Ashcombe. He turned back the leaves of a great book with his finger down the margin, and did it a second time, and shook his head, and said that no such name appeared, and that he could go back to 1880 if I liked, and he did, and it did not. I had known it would not. I had known it on the train, but standing in that office with the sun coming through a wire mesh window onto the ledger, hearing it said out loud, I felt something go out of me at the knees, and I put my hand on the corner of his desk. He was kind about it. That was the horror of the place, from first to last, that so many of them were kind. He brought me a chair and a glass of water, and said that ladies often came on such errands and were disappointed, and that families frequently did not tell the whole of a thing, and then he said the sentence that everything afterward hung from. You must understand, madam, that we do not enter a patient under any name but the one given to us by the party making the application. If the application is made by a relative who wishes the family name kept out of it, the patient is entered as the applicant directs. It is not irregular. It is the commonest thing in the world in the private houses. We have ladies here who have been with us 11 years under a name their own mother would not know. Then how does anyone ever find anybody? I said. By the application, he said. The application is signed and the certificates with it, and those are with our superintendent, and they are not shown. Not to a family, not to anybody, madam, but the party who signed, or a judge. I walked back down the drive between the chestnuts, and I did not look at the west wing, because a woman had come out onto the lawn with an attendant and was walking up and down on the grass with her arms folded across herself, and she was not old, and I could not bear it. On the train coming down, I built the last comfortable house I ever built, and I lived in it for about 9 miles. I told myself that the money went to a let property after all, and that merit was right, and I was a woman who had made a novel out of an ink stamp. I told myself that there might be an Ames cousin up there, an old aunt gone simple, a thing families do keep quiet. I laid it all out, and I got the roof on it. And then the train came around the bend below Ashcombe, and I saw the mill lit up in the dusk in the bend of the creek, and the whole thing came down because of the collar band. AR 14. In a clerk's hand, in indelible ink, on a nightgown mended twice at the elbow by somebody who was not her, packed in her trunk with her hymn book and sent home with her effects to a house where she had been dead for 2 days. Whatever they had buried on the 19th of June, they had first brought her clothes back and put them in the attic. And when a woman dies in a private asylum, her clothes come home in her trunk. And when her clothes come home in her trunk, they come home marked with the house she was in and the number she was. Dovey came to my room on the last night of August with her hair down her back and a flat paper parcel held against her middle with both arms. "You said not yet," she said. "Is it yet?" I got up and turned the key in my own door, which I had never done. And we sat on the floor between the bed and the wall like two girls at a school, with the lamp on the boards beside us. It was an album. Brass at the corners, pasteboard under a marbled paper, the mate of mine in every particular except that the paper was blue and mine was green. And I knew what it was before she had the string off it, because there was one shop in Lancaster that sold them, and there had been 40 girls at Rockridge with one apiece. "She gave it me the winter before," Dovey said. "She was showing me the writing in it, and I asked, could I keep it a night? And then she was ill, and then it was all. And I never gave it back, and afterward I was afraid, because Aunt Loretta had the fire going in the yard 2 days together, and Clemmy said it was papers." She put it in my lap. "I have looked at it 100 times. There is a piece torn out." I opened it. The first leaf was hers, her own name and the date, 1878. Then the verses, in the round hands and the sloped hands of girls who are gone now, most of them. Cornelia Prather with her pressed fern, and the Divine Sisters, and a Miss Winifred Bunn who wrote 4 lines about friendship's bark upon life's stormy sea and drew an anchor. And on the 9th leaf, in a hand I had not seen in 9 years, and knew as well as my own face, only smaller and rounder, and pressing too hard the way you do at 15. To D.R., who told me to go down and say it again at breakfast. I said it. V.K. Rockridge, 1880. I sat on the floor of my husband's house with my dead friend's album open on my knees and my own name in it in my own hand, and Dovey Ames watching me with her chin on her knees. There are moments where a whole life turns over on one small hinge, and mine turned on that one. Because if I had put that book on the fire that minute, I would have been safe. Nobody on this earth but Delphine Rourke knew that Verna Kelso had been at Rockridge. And Delphine Rourke was somewhere behind a wire mesh window, being called a number, and the only object in the state of Pennsylvania that could put me in that house for a purpose was lying open on my lap in front of a 17-year-old girl who told her aunt everything because she had nobody else to tell anything to. "Dovey," I said, "look at the 9th leaf." She looked. She read it twice. I watched her go through it the way you watch a sum come out. "VK," she said. "Verna Kelso." The lamp made a small sound the way they do. Down the hall, a door went, and we both stopped breathing until it was quiet. "You knew her," Dovey whispered. "She taught me to make a straight line," I said, "and she was the best friend I ever had in this world, and I have not said her name out loud in this county but once, in the dark, in the back room, over a book I stole out of a trunk in your attic." I came here to find out what was done with her. I married your father to get in at that door. There is the whole of it, and now you can go down and tell your aunt, and it will be finished tonight, and I will not blame you, because you are 17 and she has had you since you were 3. I have never in my life been so frightened as I was in the 4 or 5 seconds that girl took. Then Dovey Ames said, "Is the torn-out page yours too?" "No," I said. "Mine is there. The torn one is the leaf after the last of the school ones, and it is the only leaf in that book with a date after 84 in it." She put her hand flat on the album and looked at me with her mother's chin set exactly the way her brother sets his, and she said, "Then somebody wanted the last thing she wrote and did not want the rest." Aunt Loretta made me hem a sheet for 4 hours the day of the funeral, so I should not go up to the hill. Tell me what to do. I told her to say nothing, to be exactly as she had been, to keep the album where she had kept it, and to remember, if it ever came to it, on what day and out of whose hands she had received it. She has done all 3. She was 17 and she never faltered once, and there is not a day of my life since that I have not thought of what that cost her. I had the money then, and the number, and the name of the house. What I did not have was the paper. Not one thing I had was worth a spoonful of ashes without the paper, and there were exactly 2 people living who could put a hand on it, and one of them was my husband. I did it on the 2nd of September, in the barn, at 9 at night, because I had learned by then that that was where he went, and that it was the only place in Ashcombe where a woman could say a thing to Junius Ames without his sister knowing the shape of it before breakfast. He was on the bench by the harness pegs with a lantern hung over him, oiling a bridle he did not need to oil. "Junius," I said, "what is at Ardsley?" I have watched a man's face change. I had never watched one stop. Everything in it simply ceased. The way a mill stops when the belt comes off. And his hands went on for one more stroke of the rag, and then they stopped too. And he sat there with his head down, looking at the leather. "Where did you get that word?" he said. "Out of the quarterly sheets in your own counting room. $40 every quarter, since the September after your wife was buried, entered under repairs on a let house at Redwater that never wants anything else. Merritt showed you the sheets. I asked him for them, and if you punish him for it, I will leave this house on the morning train, and you may explain that to the county." My voice was going, and I let it go. "There is an advertisement in the Philadelphia Ledger for April of '84 for the Ardsley Retreat, 1 mile from Redwater Station, for the care and treatment of the insane. Strictly private. Terms upon application. $40 a quarter is the keep of one person. Who is it? Say it out loud." He put the bridle down on the bench very carefully, as if it mattered where it lay. "It was for her," he said. The barn was full of the smell of horse and oil and hay dust, and the lantern was swinging a little on its wire, and the shadows of the harness pegs went back and forth across his face. "It was for her, and it has gone on being paid, because my sister says the account was never closed out, and there is a sum owing against the last quarter, and the estate of a lunatic is a thing that takes years. And I have not—" He stopped. He put his hands over his face, a big man of 51 in his shirt sleeves in a barn, and he said through them, "I have not looked at it. I have not been able to look at any of it. You do not know what you are asking me." "Then tell me what I am asking." And he got up and went past me out of the barn and across the yard. And I stood there in the dark for the length of about a minute, thinking that I had lost it, that he was going into her, that it was finished. Then I saw the light go up in the front room, and I went in after him. And my husband was at his desk with the middle drawer out on the carpet and the papers of it on the floor around his knees. And he was going through them with both hands like a man looking for a thing to stop a bleeding. He found it, and he stood up, and he held it out to me at arm's length, and turned his face away, and he said, "There, that is what you married." I took it to the lamp. It was 2 sheets of blue foolscap folded together, printed with the blanks filled in, and it was 3 years and 5 months old, and the creases were soft where somebody had folded and unfolded it a great many times. The first sheet was headed, "Application for the Admission of a Patient," and it was to the superintendent of the Ardsley Retreat, and it set out that the applicant, being the husband of the person named, requested the reception of Delphine R. Ames, aged 27 years, of Ashcombe, Sadler County. Under the head of the alleged cause of the malady, in a copperplate clerk's hand, was written, "Domestic trouble, the death of a near relative, unfounded suspicion of her connections." Under the head of whether suicidal or dangerous to others, has used violence toward a child of the family. Under the name in which the patient is to be entered upon the books of the house, in the same clerk's hand, A. Rourke, and at the foot of it, in ink gone brown, in a heavy hand with a blot at the tail of the last letter, the signature of Junius Ames. The second sheet was the certificates, 2 of them on the one form, each with its own oath. I, Orrin Spate of Ashcombe, Doctor of Medicine, having personally examined the said Delphine R. Ames on the 11th day of April, do certify that she is of unsound mind and a proper person to be confined. And beneath it, in a thin, uncertain hand with the pen pressed too hard at the start of every word, I, Ezra Culp of Redwater, Doctor of Medicine, do certify the same, having personally examined the said Delphine R. Ames on the 12th day of April. Dated the 14th of April, 1884, 64 days before the 17th of June. I stood in that room with the paper in both hands, and the sound in my ears was so loud that I saw my husband's mouth move twice before I heard anything come out of it. "She was not mad," he said. I looked up. "Say that again?" "She was not mad." He was standing by the cold grate with his hand on the mantel, and he was crying, without any noise, the way men of that generation did, with his face perfectly still and the water running down into his beard. She was angry. She had been in the books. She came into this room on a Tuesday night in April and put a sheet of my sister's figures on that desk and said there was 30 years of it and she would take it to her uncle's man in Philadelphia. And I told her that she did not understand a mill, and she said, "Junius, I understand a column." And Loretta was in the doorway behind her the whole time, and I did not know how long she had been there. "And you signed this?" "Not that night." He wiped his face with the flat of his hand, once, and it did no good. 3 weeks, 3 weeks of it, spite in and out of the house twice a day, my sister at me morning and night, that she was strange with Dovey, that she had struck the girl, which I never saw, that there was talk of her in the town, that a Rourke had died in an asylum in Delaware and it was in the blood, and Delphine would not come down to dinner, and would not speak to me, and locked her door, and I thought... He stopped, and got hold of the mantle, and said the thing he had been carrying for 3 years, and I have never heard a man's voice sound like that before or since. I thought that if she was ill, it would be 6 weeks, a rest. That is what it was called at this fireside, a rest for 6 weeks, and Spite would fetch her home himself. And on the 17th of June, Spite came to the mill office at 11 in the morning and took off his hat and told me she had died in the night of an inflammation of the brain, and gave me the certificate, and I have not been able to get a full breath from that day to this. "Did you see her?" I said. "What?" "After. Did you see her? Did anybody in this house open that coffin?" He looked at me, and I watched the question arrive in him, 3 years and 3 months late, and go all the way down. "It came sealed from the house at Redwater," he said, "by direction of the physician. On account of the tema," he stopped. He said very slowly, "Loretta met the train." I put the 2 sheets of blue foolscap down on the desk under the lamp, and I set my hand flat on them, and I said the sentence I had been building since a nail keg in the back of a dead man's store. "Junius, your wife is alive." He did not shout. He did not fall down. He said no in a perfectly reasonable voice, the way you correct a child about a sum, and then he sat down in the chair by the grate and said it 3 more times, each one smaller. And then he did not say anything at all for about a quarter of an hour, and I let him alone, because I had had 3 years and 8 months to do what I was asking him to do in a quarter of an hour. At the end of it, he said, "It is not possible. There is a certificate of death. There is a stone. There is a stone that your sister ordered, on a plot your sister keeps, over a coffin your sister signed for at the depot and would not let 4 men open. And there is a house that has been paid $40 a quarter for 13 quarters for a patient entered on their books under the name A. Rourke. And there is a nightgown in this house marked AR 14. And there is a letter in my trunk in her hand, postmarked at Redwater, 9 days after that stone says she died." I was shaking so hard by then that I had to hold the edge of the desk. "And you know it. You have known something since the day a man took his hat off in your office. And you have spent 3 years keeping yourself from finding out what." He put his head back against the chair and shut his eyes. "If it is true," he said, "then I am a man who put his wife in a madhouse and married a girl of 23. And there is no bottom to it, Verna. There is no bottom to it anywhere." "There is one," I said. "The bottom is that she is up there tonight." The letter from Philadelphia came on the 3rd of September, and Loretta opened it, because she opened all of them, and left it on the hall table with the others, because by then I had been in that house 4 months and was furniture. It was from Tobias Renner of Renner and Vale, Walnut Street, surviving trustee under the will of Ephraim Rourke. It was addressed to Junius. It said, in the driest language I have ever read, and I have read a good deal of it since, that Mr. Renner had for 3 years declined to make distribution of the principal of the Rourke Trust upon the certificate furnished, that certificate having been made at a private house of detention and not by any officer of the county, and having been unsupported by any inquest, view, or identification by a member of the family. That Mr. Ames's attorney had now petitioned the Orphans' Court of the County of Philadelphia to compel a final accounting and distribution, that the court had fixed the hearing, and that in the absence of any showing to the contrary, Mr. Renner would be obliged to pay over the fund. $52,000 in railroad bonds and the 2 houses in Rourke Street. I stood in that hall with my bonnet still on and read it twice, And the third time I read the one line that mattered, which was the date the court had fixed. The first Tuesday in October. 31 days. My husband held for 1 day, and then he did the thing he had been doing all his life, which was to take it to his sister. I understood afterward that he could not have done anything else. A man of 51 does not come out from under a woman who has run his house and his conscience for 30 years because his third wife shows him an advertisement in a newspaper. He wanted it not to be true. And there was one person in the world who could tell him it was not true, in a voice he had been obeying since he was 21. And on the Saturday night he went and stood in the doorway of her sitting room and asked her a single question. I know what the question was because Clemmy Doak heard it from the back stair, and Clemmy Doak told me a week later when it did not matter anymore, and it was the bravest thing that quiet woman ever did. He said, "Loretta, did you meet the train?" She said, "Go to bed, Junius." And he went to bed. On the Monday, Dr. Orrin Spite called at the house at 4 in the afternoon, and he did not ask for me. He was an hour and 10 minutes with Miss Ames in the front room with the door shut, and when he came out, he was carrying his hat and gloves in his left hand, and he stopped in the hall where I was doing the lamps and looked at me for a moment with his head on one side and said, in the pleasantest voice imaginable, "Mrs. Ames, you are not looking at all well. I hope you sleep." "Very soundly, doctor," I said, and my hands were steady, and I have never been prouder of anything I have done. "That is good hearing," he said. "It is often the last thing to go." That is the sentence he said. I want you to have it exactly, because there are people listening to this who have been told by somebody with clean hands and a kind voice that they are not looking at all well, and who have gone up the stairs afterward and sat on the edge of the bed and wondered whether it might be so. He did not threaten me. In 1887, he did not have to. A physician in a county town could sign 1/2 of a paper that would put a woman behind a wire mesh window for the rest of her natural life, and the other half was $15 away, and we both knew it, and he wished me good evening and went out to his buggy. Tuesday, I was not permitted to be alone. That is a hard thing to describe to anybody who has not had it done to them, because nothing whatever happens. Loretta wanted my help with the pears. Loretta thought we should do the linen press together. When I said I would walk to the post office, Loretta had been meaning to walk to the post office herself and put on her bonnet. When I went up to my room, the sewing girl was sent up to sit in the passage with the mending because the light was better there, and the light was not better there. At 2 o'clock I went into the kitchen for a drink of water, and Clemmy Doak was at the sink with her back to me, and she said to the window without turning around, "Wednesday the aide meets here." "I know it." "You are to keep your room. She told me to carry your dinner up." Clemmy turned the tap and let it run over her wrists. "The doctor is coming at 3 with a man from Redwater, and Sim is to have the closed carriage at the side door and not the front, and I am to have your trunk down by 2 o'clock. I stood in that kitchen and the floor went a long way off. "Clemmy," I said, "how do you know what is to happen at 3? "Because I had the trunk down at 2 o'clock on the 15th of April in '84, said Clemmy Doak, "and I have not slept a whole night since, and I am 40 years of age, and I have nowhere else on this earth to go, and I am telling you now, and that is the whole of what I have got." Here is what a woman in my position had, in that county, in that year. She had no money of her own because the $40 was for the house and was accounted for. She had no relation nearer than a boarding house keeper on Canal Street. She could not go to the sheriff because there was nothing to charge and no crime that anybody had named yet, and the sheriff's wife was on the aid. She could not go to Dr. Spite, obviously, and there was no other doctor in Ashcombe. She could not telegraph to Philadelphia and wait 2 days for an answer, because she did not have 2 days. She had 23 hours, and she could not run. That was the part I had to see clearly, sitting on the edge of my bed on the Tuesday night with my hands between my knees. If I went out of that house on the early train, then a young woman had married an elderly mill owner in May and run off in September. And by Friday, the whole county would have the story from Loretta Ames, and it would be the same story in the same 3 words, off her head. And she would have it printed on me before I got to Philadelphia, and every door I knocked at afterward would have heard it first. There was exactly one thing in the world that Loretta Ames could not do anything about, and it was witnesses. Not one witness. She had beaten 1 witness at a depot in 1884, and she had beaten 1 witness in a barn on Saturday night. 9 at once, in her own parlor, in daylight, in front of the sheriff's wife and the minister's wife and the president of the Ladies' Aid, was another kind of animal altogether. So I did not run. I got up on the Wednesday morning and dressed with particular care, in the gray poplin with the white collar, and did my hair flat and plain the way a sensible woman does it, because I knew exactly what I was about to be called, and I did not intend to look it. I put the letter and the flyleaf and the 2 sheets of blue foolscap out of my husband's desk drawer, which I had taken up to my room on Saturday night and never given back, into the pocket under my skirt. And at 2:30, while Clemmy was carrying my trunk down the back stairs with tears running off her chin, I sat at my window and watched the buggies come up Bell Street. They met in the front parlor at 3. 9 of them. Mrs. Curtis Trent, the president, and Mrs. Sedgwick, the minister's wife, and Mrs. Pruitt, whose husband was the sheriff, and Miss Ivy Lorne, who taught the primary school, and the 2 Curlin sisters, and Mrs. Rupp, the undertaker's wife, and old Mrs. Bracy, who was Sim's cousin by marriage, and my mother's second cousin, Ottilie Vandegrift, who had been put on the aid in June and had told me about it 4 times. I came down the black walnut stair at 10 minutes past 3 with the parlor door standing open and the tea going in, and Loretta Ames at the head of the room with the work basket on her knees. She saw me in the doorway, and I will say this for her until the day I die. That woman did not change color, did not stop her needle, and said, in a voice of perfect kindness that carried to every corner of that room, "Verna, my dear, you were to rest. Ladies, my brother's wife has not been at all well." "I am perfectly well," I said, "and I am going to say something in front of you all, and then you may judge for yourselves which of us is not well, and you may say so to your husbands at supper, and I would take it as a kindness if you would." 9 faces came around. There is a sound a room like that makes, a small sound of 9 cups going down onto 9 saucers, and I have heard it in my sleep for 40 years. "There is a woman living tonight at the Ardsley Retreat above Redwater," I said. "She is entered on the books of that house under the name A. Rourke. She has been there since the 14th of April, 1884, on an application signed by my husband, and on the certificates of Orrin Spite of this town and Ezra Culp of Redwater. Her name is Delphine Rourke Ames, and this county buried her on the 19th of June of that year in a coffin that came sealed from Redwater by direction of the physician, that 4 men lifted off a baggage truck and said among themselves was light, and that no member of her family ever opened. Miss Ames signed for it at the depot. Miss Ames ordered the stone. Miss Ames has paid that house $40 every quarter since, and entered it in the accounts under repairs to a let property, and I have seen the sheets in her own hand, and so has Merritt Ames." The room did not make a sound. "And at 3 o'clock this afternoon," I said, "which is 20 minutes ago, Doctor, Spite is to call at this house with a second physician from Redwater, and my trunk is standing packed at the foot of the back stairs, and Sim Bracey has been told to bring the closed carriage to the side door and not the front. And that is why I am standing in this room instead of in my own, ladies, and it is the only reason. I would rather be thought mad by 9 women who can see me than be carried out of a side door by 2 men and never thought of at all." Loretta Ames set down her work basket and stood up and folded her hands at her waist and said, "The poor child is not well. She lost her father in the autumn, and it has told upon her. Mrs. Sedgwick, if you would be so good as to ring." And Ottilie Vandegrift stood up. She was a stout woman of 60 in a bonnet that had been good in 1879, and she had 11 boarders and a bad furnace and no standing in that room at all. And she stood up out of that chair with her cup still in her hand and said, "Loretta, I have known this girl's mother's family for 40 years, and there is no madness in it. And I have watched you take that child's name away from her at 4 sewing meetings running with that same kind voice. I want to hear the rest." And then the door to the hall, which had been standing half open, opened the whole way, and Dovey Ames came in with the blue album against her chest and said, to 9 women and her aunt, in a voice that shook so hard she could barely get it out, "It is true. She used to plait my hair. I have got her book, and there is a page cut out of it, and I have had it hid 3 years because I was afraid of you. I have been in a courtroom since. I have heard a jury come in. Nothing in my life has ever been like the silence in that parlor." Loretta looked at her niece for a long moment, and something went across her face at last. And it was not fear, and it was not shame. I have thought about it for 40 years, and the only word I have ever found for it is annoyance. The look of a woman who has kept a house in order for 30 years and has come down to find that somebody has left a door open. "Sit down, Dovey," she said. "I will not," said Dovey Ames. The aide did not finish its meeting. They went out 1 and 2 at a time in that way people have, and not one of them looked at me, and by 6 o'clock that evening, the story was in 9 kitchens, and by noon the next day it was in the mill, and after that it did not belong to Loretta Ames any more, and it never came back to her. That was the whole object. I did not convince one soul in that parlor. Convincing was never the point. The point was that after 10 minutes past 3 on the 7th of September, 1887, nobody could put me in a closed carriage quietly. Dr. Spite arrived at 3:40 with a thin man in a black coat and was met in the hall by Mrs. Vandegrift, who informed him that Mrs. Ames was going home with her and that Mrs. Sedgwick and Mrs. Pruitt were still in the front room and would be happy to see him. He said that there appeared to have been a misunderstanding. He said it twice. He did not take off his coat, and he did not come in, and I walked out of the front door of the Ames house at 4 o'clock in the afternoon with my own trunk on Sim Bracey's spring wagon, and my husband standing in the window of the front room watching me go, and not one hand raised to stop it, either way. I never slept another night under that roof. Rand Mosby had his office over the harness shop on Water Street and had been admitted to the bar of Sadler County 2 years and 4 months. He was 28, he had a bad coat and a good desk, and he had 3 clients, 2 of them relations. Every established lawyer in that town did business with the Ames Mill or the bank that held its mortgage, and I found that out in one morning, which is how I came to be sitting in front of the youngest one. I put it all on that desk on the Thursday morning. The letter with the Redwater postmark, the flyleaf and the hymn book with the cut stub, the album with my own hand in it, the nightgown with the collar band, the quarterly sheets that Merritt Ames had copied out for me in his own hand and signed and dated at the bottom, the 2 sheets of blue foolscap and Renner's letter. He read for 50 minutes without saying one word. Then he got up and stood at the window with his back to me for a while, and then he came and sat down and said, "Mrs. Ames, I am going to tell you 3 things, and you are not going to like any of them." "Go on." "The first is that everything you have got proves that a woman was committed. It does not prove she is alive today. 3 years is a long time in a house like that, and people do die in them." He held up his hand before I could speak. "The second is that a fraud worked in April of '84 is very likely out of reach. But a death certificate is a different animal, and the trust is a different animal again. And if that fund is paid over on a false certificate, that is a fraud committed this October in this county in front of us by people who are all alive." He turned his pen over once. "And the third is that there is no proceeding on God's earth by which you, personally, can walk into that house and demand to see anybody. You are not her kin. Your husband is her kin, and he signed the application, and he will not act." "Then what is there?" "There is one thing," said Rand Mosby. "It is old, and it is short, and it is the best writ in the English language, and it does not care in the least who you are. Any person may apply for it on behalf of anybody restrained of their liberty. A judge of the common pleas of this county may issue it against the superintendent of that house, and it commands him to produce the body of the person detained, in court, alive, at a stated hour, together with the cause of the detention." He tapped the papers twice. "They cannot answer it with a certificate. They cannot answer it with a letter. They must bring her, or they must state on the record what became of her. And if they state that she died, then we will have the day and the hour and the burial and the physician. And then, madam, we will go and see about the grave on the hill." I sat there, and my hands would not stay still in my lap. "How long?" I said. "Judge Tench sits at Sadler Courthouse. He is 71, he is honest, he is deaf, and he dislikes the Ames family because Loretta Ames had his sister put off the Cemetery Association in 1880. I can be before him Monday." He was already writing. "But I want the second doctor first." Ezra Culp lived in 3 rooms behind a store at Redwater, and we went up on the Saturday train, and Mosby carried the papers in a satchel, and I carried nothing at all, and neither of us said much on the way. He was 68, and he was dying, and anybody could see it. He had the cough that does not stop, and he had it standing in the doorway with his hand on the frame, and behind him the room was cold, and there were 2 chairs and a table with a bottle on it, and no fire in September. He had practiced 40 years in those hills, delivered half the county, and taken his fees in butter and cordwood, and at the end of it he had that room. Mosby put the second sheet of the blue foolscap down on the table in front of him and said, "Doctor, is that your signature?" He looked at it for a long time. Then he sat down, slowly, the way a man sits down when his knees have been telling him something for a while. "Yes," he said. "Did you examine Delphine Ames on the 12th of April, 1884? And the old man put both hands over his face and said into them, "No." We waited. There was a clock going in that room and nothing else. "Spite brought the form up on the noon train," he said. "It was filled out already, the whole of it, in a clerk's hand, and he had his own part signed. He said the lady was violent, and that the family was distracted, and that he could not get another man from Ashcombe without it being all over the town by Friday, and that it was a kindness to the husband. He put $15 on that table. He took his hands down. His eyes were wet and red and old. I had a wife then. She had been 3 years abed. I have gone over it 10,000 times, and I will tell you what the truth of it is, sir, and it is not the $15, though I took the $15. It is that Orrin Spite was the family's man, and I was a hill doctor with a sick wife, and he stood in my house and told me what was so, and I wanted very much for it to be so, and I signed it. I have never signed another. I gave it up in the spring of '85, and I have lived on what you see. Mosby said very quietly, "Doctor, will you swear to that in court?" Ezra Culp looked around that cold room, at the 2 chairs and the bottle, and the window with the hills going up behind it. "Young man," he said, "I have got about 4 months. What in the name of heaven do you suppose there is left in this world to frighten me with?" The writ was issued out of the Court of Common Pleas of Sadler County on Monday, the 12th of September, 1887, directed to the superintendent of the Ardsley Retreat, commanding him to have the body of one Delphine Rourke Ames, otherwise called A. Rourke, before the court at 10 o'clock in the forenoon on Thursday the 15th, together with the day and cause of her detention. The sheriff of Sadler County served it himself at the gate under the chestnuts at 4 o'clock on the Tuesday afternoon. I was standing across the road. The superintendent of the Ardsley Retreat was a man named Dr. Hollis Vandermark, and he did not fight the writ. I have thought about that a great deal. Mosby said afterward that he had expected 2 days of skirmishing and got none, and that in his experience, a house that fights a writ has something in the cellar, and a house that answers it by return has only a ledger. Ardsley had a ledger. It had taken a patient in the ordinary way on a signed application and 2 certificates from a family of standing, and it had been paid $40 a quarter for 13 quarters without 1 day's default, and its books were in order, and it had never in its life told anybody that the woman in the West Wing was dead, because nobody had ever asked it. Whatever was rotten in that business had been done in a brick house on Bell Street, and in a doctor's buggy, and at a depot, and not on that hill. The hill had only kept her. There is a whole lesson in that, about what it takes to disappear a person, and it is not one great wickedness. It is one great wickedness, and then 11 ordinary people doing their work correctly for 3 years and never asking a question that is not on the form. On the Wednesday evening, my husband came to Mrs. Vandegrift's boarding house. He came on foot, in the dark, without the buggy, and he stood in the little front parlor among the boarders' magazines with his hat in both hands, and he had aged 10 years since the 7th. Mrs. Vandegrift showed him in and left the door open exactly 4 inches and sat in the hall with her mending, and I have loved that woman ever since. "They have subpoenaed me," he said. "I know it." "Verna." He turned the hat around. "What is going to happen to me?" I had known he would ask that. It is what he was. He was not a wicked man, and I will go to my grave saying it, and that is the whole horror of him, because a wicked man could not have done 1/10 of the damage that Junius Ames did by being weak in a comfortable chair for 30 years. "Tomorrow at 10 o'clock, I said, "a carriage is going to come down off that hill, and either she will be in it or she will not. If she is not, then you will have to bear what she died of and where. And if she is—" I stopped, because it was the first time I had made myself go the whole way along that road out loud. and it was worse said than thought. "If she is," I said, "then Delphine Rourke has been your lawful wife every day of these 3 years. And she was your lawful wife on the 12th of May when the minister stood in your front room. And I am not your wife. I have never been your wife. There is no marriage. There is my name in a register, and there is nothing under it." He sat down on the boarder's horsehair sofa without being asked, which he had never done in his life, and he put the hat on his knee. "I did not know," he said. "I did," I said. He looked up. "Not the whole of it, but I knew there was something wrong in the ground under that house before ever I let you into Mrs. Vandergrift's front parlor with your hat in your hands, and I let you say it anyway, and I said yes on the 28th of April with a dead woman's letter sewn into the lining of my trunk." My voice was quite steady, which surprised me. "So you may sit there and be sorry for yourself if you like, Junius, but you will not be sorry at me. I used you. You are the only person in this business I did a wrong to on purpose, and I would do it again tomorrow, and there it is." He was quiet for a long time. Out in the hall, Mrs. Vandergrift's needle went in and out. "She was quicker than anybody in this county," he said at last to the carpet. "I told you that in May. It is the only true thing I have said to a woman in 4 years. He stood up and put his hat on. At the door he stopped and said, without turning around, "If she is in that carriage, do not let her look at me first. Let it be you. She has got no reason to want my face." That was the last thing my husband ever said to me alone, and I have never been able to decide in 40 years whether it was the decency of the man or the cowardice. And I have come around to thinking that in some people there is no line between the two at all. I did not sleep that night, and I did not try. Mrs. Vandergrift's back bedroom had a slope in the floor and a window that looked over the roofs of Canal Street to the mill and the Black Hill behind it. I sat in that window from 11 o'clock until the sky went gray, in my wrapper, with the tin box open on the sill beside me and the lamp out, because I did not want the light and I did not want to see the room. I took out the 51 letters. I had not read them through in order since I was 19 years old. I read them all, from the first one out of Philadelphia in the winter after I came home from Rockridge, with the ink turned up the sides of the sheet to save postage, to the 6 lines with the small, cramped writing at the bottom. "I am well. Remember that I told you I was well." It took me until nearly 3. I read about the concerts and the uncle's cough, about the man she got out of marrying, about the black walnut rail being the only honest thing in the house, about a stepdaughter of 13 who would not stop looking at her. And I sat in that window and let myself understand a thing I had been holding off with both hands for a month, which is that if I had gone to Ashcombe in the summer of 1884, instead of writing a cheerful letter about my father's store, she would have been 3 years younger, and I would have been 3 years less use, and she might have been out in a month. There is no bottom to that either. You can go down and down. At some point along toward 4 o'clock in the morning, I put my head against the window frame and said, out loud, to the glass, "I am sorry I was 17, which does not mean anything. And then I got up and washed my face in cold water and dressed. I put on the gray poplin again. I did my hair the same flat way. Mrs. Vandergrift had the coffee going at 5:30 and would not let me leave the table until I had eaten a boiled egg, standing over me with her arms folded like a woman putting a horse into a cart. And I ate it, and I do not remember it. At 8:30, I put into my pocket the letter, the flyleaf, the hymn book, the collar band cut from the nightgown, the album, the copied sheets in Merritt's hand, and the 2 blue sheets of foolscap. And at 9 o'clock, on the morning of Thursday the 15th of September, 1887, I walked up Water Street to the courthouse with Ottilie Vandegrift on one side of me and Dovey Ames on the other. And Dovey had come down the back stairs of her father's house at 7 with her boots in her hand. The square was full. I had not expected that, and I nearly turned around at the corner. Merritt Ames had shut the mill at 9 o'clock that morning on his own authority, the first order he had ever given in that place without asking anybody, and 410 hands had walked down the mill road in their aprons. The store on the corner had its shutters up. There were farm wagons standing 3 deep along the east side with whole families in them, and men up on the wall of the churchyard, and the steps of the courthouse were packed to the doors, and every window across the square had faces in it. They had heard it in 9 kitchens on the Wednesday of the week before. 9 kitchens is the whole world, and the whole world had come to see whether it was true. Inside, the courtroom was a long, plain room with a gallery, and it held perhaps 200, and there were 400 trying. Judge Rufus Tench came in at 10 minutes to 10, 71 years old, with a face like a hatchet and a brass ear trumpet that he laid on the bench in front of him and used as a gavel when he was displeased. Mosby was at the table with the papers squared. Dr. Spite was in the 3rd row on the aisle, with his hat on his knees and his color not good. My husband sat at the end of the 2nd row with his son beside him, and neither of them spoke to the other once. And on the front bench, in black, upright, with her gloved hands folded on a small, closed reticule, and her white hair parted in the exact center of her head, sat Miss Loretta Ames. She had come. Nobody had made her come, and the subpoena that was served on her was for the 4th of October, and not for that day. And she had put on her good black, and had Sim Bracey drive her to the front of the courthouse at 9:30, and had walked up those steps through 400 people who went quiet as she came, and had taken a seat at the front where every soul in that room could see the back of her head, and she sat there without moving for 2 hours and 10 minutes. I have been asked why. I think I know. I think that when a woman has run a thing for 30 years, she cannot conceive of it running without her in the room. I think she came to see whether it could still be managed. And I think, and this is the part I would not say to the newspapers, that there was a piece of her that had wanted for 3 years to see the door of that carriage open, and had never once let itself say so. At 2 minutes past 10, there was a sound outside that came in through the open windows, and it was 400 people in a square, all making the same noise at once, and it went along the room and up into the gallery, and the whole courtroom stood up. Judge Tench hit the bench with the ear trumpet and said that he would clear it, and nobody sat down, and he did not clear it. The sheriff came in first, then Dr. Vandermark in a gray suit, with his hat in his hand and his clerk behind him carrying the books. Then a stout woman of 50 in a plain bonnet and a black cloak, who was Mrs. Alma Prine, matron of the ladies' wing, and who was carrying, held against her front with both arms in a way I did not understand for another hour, a parcel wrapped in brown paper and tied with tape. And then, walking by herself, with nobody's hand on her arm, Delphine Rourke. I am going to try to tell you what I saw, and I have never once got it right. She was thin. She had been a tall, full-figured woman with black hair that would not stay pinned, and she was thin now in the way that is not slenderness, with her wrists standing out of the cuffs of a gray stuff dress that had been made for the house and not for her. Her hair was cut off short at the neck, the way they did it, and it had gone gray at both temples, and she was 30 years old. Her skin was the color of the inside of a shell, because she had been 3 years and 5 months in a building and on one lawn. And she walked in a particular way that I have seen since in other people who have come out of those places and that I would know anywhere on this earth, which is very upright and very quiet, with the hands still, looking at nothing, taking up no room at all. That is what they had made her, not raving, careful. She came down the aisle and her eyes went over that courtroom, over 200 faces and the gallery and the windows, without stopping on anything, the way you look at a wall. They went over Orrin Spite and did not stop. They went over Junius Ames and did not stop, and I saw my husband's head go down. They went over the front bench where Loretta Ames sat, and they did not stop there either. And the not stopping was the most terrible thing I have ever watched one human being do to another. And then they came to me, standing at the end of the third row in a gray poplin dress with my hair done flat. She stopped walking. The sheriff said something to her, and she did not hear it. She stood in the aisle of the Sadler County courthouse and looked at me, and her face did not move. And I understood later, when I knew what those 3 years had been, exactly what was happening behind it, which was that she was deciding whether I was there. I got out one word. I got out her name. And Delphine Rourke said in a low, even, perfectly steady voice, without moving anything but her mouth, "Do not cry in front of them. They write it down." Then she put out her hand, and I took it, and it was cold and light and rough across the palms in a way it had never been in her life. And the two of us stood there in the middle aisle in front of the entire county, holding on. And I did exactly what she told me and did not cry, and it is the hardest thing I have ever done. They put her in the chair by the clerk's desk. Mrs. Prine sat behind her with the brown paper parcel on her knees. Dr. Vandermark made his return to the writ, standing, reading from his own book. He stated that a person answering the description had been received into the retreat on the 15th day of April, 1884, upon the written application of Junius Ames, husband, supported by the certificates of 2 physicians, Orrin Spite and Ezra Culp, that she had been entered upon the books, at the written direction of the applicant, under the name A. Rourke, that she had been assigned to the ladies' wing and had been, so far as the house knew, in continuous residence since, that the charge of $40 a quarter had been paid without default by the family, that the house had at no time received any notice, order, or communication respecting her death, and that he produced her body in court as commanded. He then said, and the room went so quiet you could hear the ear trumpet come down on the bench. "I will add, sir, because the writ asks the cause of the detention, that our medical officer's entries upon this patient for the last 2 years and upward are in the words, no change, quiet, and employed in the linen room, and that in the whole of my superintendency, I have never before been asked to produce a patient who was reported dead in the county in which she was born." Judge Tench leaned forward. "Doctor," he said, "reported dead by whom?" "That, sir," said Dr. Vandermark, "is not in my books." Mosby put Ezra Culp on first, because Mosby was 28 years old and had exactly one instinct in a courtroom, and it was a good one, which was to break the smallest link in the chain first and let the rest hang. The old man came up the aisle with the cough taking him twice on the way, and was sworn and sat, and Mosby put the second sheet of the blue foolscap in his hands and asked him 3 questions. "Is that your name?" "Yes." "Did you write it?" "Yes." "Did you, on the 12th day of April, 1884, or upon any other day, examine the person now sitting in this room?" And Ezra Culp said, "No, sir, I never saw that lady in my life until this morning." There was a sound in that courtroom like a wave going out over stones. Spite was on his feet. He was saying something about a most improper proceeding and about the old man's condition being notorious, and the judge picked up the ear trumpet and hit the bench with it 4 times and told Dr. Orrin Spite to sit down or be taken down. And Spite sat down, and I watched it happen to him. The thing I had waited 3 years and 8 months to watch happen to somebody in that county, which was that a smooth, pink man with clean hands and a gold chain looked around a full courtroom for the face of the person who was going to manage this for him, and found it on the front bench, and it was not looking at him. She never turned her head. She sat with her gloved hands folded on her reticule and her eyes on the bench, and she left him standing in it. And every human being in that room saw her do it. Mrs. Alma Prine was sworn next, and she came up to that chair with the brown paper parcel still held against her front, and she would not put it down on the clerk's desk when he reached for it. She sat with it on her knees and both hands on top of it, the way a woman holds a thing she has been carrying a long way. She had been matron of the ladies' wing at Ardsley for 19 years. She said that the patient entered as A. Rourke had come to her on the 15th of April, 1884, in a closed carriage at 9 in the evening with a doctor and a lady, that the lady had done the talking, that she had received 2 instructions and had them in writing in the house book, and would read them if the court desired. Judge Tench said that the court did desire. "The first," said Mrs. Prine, "is that no name is to be used to the patient or before her but the one on the books. The second is that the patient's letters are not to go into the post, but are to be enclosed under cover to Dr. Spite at Ashcombe, who will see to the family's part of it." Mosby said, "And did you do that, ma'am?" "For 11 months I did." She sat up very straight in that chair, and she was a stout, plain woman of 50, in a cloak that had been turned once, and she looked at the judge and not at the lawyer. "I sent up 40 and some under cover to that gentleman there, and I never had one word back, and I never saw an answer come for her, and no soul ever came to visit her. And in the November of that first year, she asked me whether her uncle's man in Philadelphia had written, and I had to say I did not know, and that was the last question she ever asked me about the outside. And after 11 months, "After 11 months, said Mrs. Prine, "I stopped." The room did not make a sound. "I could not put them in the post, sir, because that would have been against my instructions, and I would have been out of my place at 50 years of age. So I did what a woman does when she has not got the courage of the whole thing, and I have not been proud of it one day since. I put them in the bottom drawer of my desk in the linen room, and I locked it. And I told her the truth of what I was doing, which was that I would keep every one of them, and that if ever anybody in this world came to ask after her, they should have them all." She lifted the parcel a little. "There are 141. They are in the order they were written." She stopped writing in the spring of '86. Mosby let that sit for a moment. Then he said, "Mrs. Prine, is any one of those letters addressed to a person now in this room?" "The first 11 are to a gentleman named Renner of Walnut Street, Philadelphia," she said. 9 are to her husband. 2 are to a child called Dovey. And the rest of them, sir, the whole of the rest of them, more than 100, are directed to Miss Verna Kelso at Bell Furnace in the care of a dry goods store. I have been told since what I did. I do not remember doing it. Ottilie Vandegrift says I made no noise at all, that I simply sat down on the bench behind me as if somebody had taken the bones out of my legs. and that Dovey Ames got both arms around me and held on. What I remember is the shape of the parcel, and thinking, with a clarity I have never had before or since, that it was about the size of the box of buttons my father bought in the year I was born and never sold one of, and that he had put a letter in a cigar box and got sick and died, and that between the two of them, that store and that linen room, there had been 3 years of a woman writing to me every week, and not one page of it ever crossing a county line. Then they swore Delphine. She took the book in her hand and gave her name in full, Delphine Rourke Ames, born at Philadelphia, 30 years of age, and she said it in a voice that was quiet and flat and did not carry to the back, and Judge Tench turned his ear trumpet toward her and told her that she might take her time and that this court would wait upon her as long as she liked. She was on that stand 50 minutes. I am not going to give you all of it. I will give you the parts the county talked about for 20 years. Mosby asked her when she had first learned that she had been reported dead in Sadler County. At 20 minutes past 8 this morning, she said, in the carriage, this gentleman told me. I did not believe him. I have been 3 years being told things in carriages. Mosby asked her whether she had at any time been of unsound mind. I do not know how a person is to answer that, she said. I will tell the court what happened, and the court may say. And she turned a little in the chair toward the bench, and she told it in the flattest voice in the world, and the flatness of it was worse than any weeping would have been. She told about her Uncle Ephraim dying in the March, and the trust, and the fact that under his will the income was hers for life, and the principal came to her at 35, and that if she died before that day, it went to her husband. She said she had put that document in her own hands and read it twice, and had not thought about it again for 2 months, because she was a young woman, and 35 was a long way off. She told about the mill books. In the February of that year, she had begun to keep the household account herself, because she was the mistress of the house, and it seemed to her a strange thing that she was not permitted to. And in the course of it, she had asked for the private book, and been refused, and had gone up to the counting room one afternoon in the week before Easter, when there was nobody there but a boy, and had taken down 3 years of quarterly sheets, and sat on the high stool and footed them herself. I found, she said, that my husband's sister had been drawing upon that mill for 30 years, in sums of $40 and $60 and $100, entered under repairs, charities, and the doctor. I found that in the spring of 1883 she had lent the mill $14,000 of her own money, which was in fact the mill's own money, that had been going into her account since before I was born, and had taken a mortgage upon the mill in her own name to secure it, and had had it recorded, and that her mortgage stood ahead of the bank's, and I found that my husband had signed it and did not know what he had signed, because my husband has not read a column of figures since 1876. Judge Tench said, "Madam, what did you do with that?" "I brought it downstairs on a Tuesday night in April," said Delphine Rourke, "and I put it on his desk in the front room, and I said I would take it to my uncle's man in Philadelphia, and his sister was standing in the doorway behind me, and I did not know how long she had been there." She looked at the bench, and she said, 11 days later, a doctor came and sat in the back parlor with his hat on his knee and asked me whether I ever felt that I was watched. I heard my own breath go, and I was not the only one. She told the rest of it in about 4 minutes, and there is not a word in it I could improve upon, so I will give it to you as it went into the newspapers. That on the 15th of April she had been told at 9 in the morning that she was to be taken for a rest of 6 weeks, that she had refused and had gone up to her room and had been reasoned with all that day by the doctor and by her husband's sister, and that at 8 in the evening 2 men she had never seen came into the house, and she went down the stairs between them with her arm held above the elbow, and that her husband was in the barn, that her trunk was carried out behind her, packed by a servant who was crying, that the last thing she saw of the town of Ashcombe was the lamp in the window of the front room, lit, with nobody in the room, that she had believed, for the first 6 weeks, that she was coming home at the end of them, that she had spent the summer of 1884 demanding to see the superintendent, and had seen him, and had told him the whole of the mortgage business, and had watched him write it down in a book under the head of the patient's fixed idea respecting her family's money. "That is the trap, sir," she said to Judge Tench, "and I would like it in the record, because there are women in that house tonight. Everything you say to prove you are sane is entered as a symptom. If you are quiet, they write that you are sullen. If you weep, they write that you are excitable. If you say that you have been put away wrongly, they write, and they wrote it of me for 2 years, that the patient labors under the delusion that she has been wrongfully confined. There is no sentence in the English language that you can say in that room that goes the other way. So in the spring of 1886, I stopped saying anything at all, and they wrote, 'No change, quiet,' and employed in the linen room. And I was let out onto the lawn, and I have been let out onto the lawn every fine day since." Mosby said gently, "And you stopped writing letters." "I stopped writing letters," said Delphine, "because I had written 141, and 30 of them to a girl I taught to make a straight line, and not one had ever been answered. And I decided at last that she was dead, or married, or had thought better of me." She stopped. It was the only time in 50 minutes that her voice went, and it went for about half a second, and she took it back. "I beg the court's pardon. I have been told this morning that she was not any of those things. I have not had time to think about it." They called Loretta Ames at 12:30. She went up that aisle without being touched by anybody, and took the book in her gloved hand, and was sworn, and sat down, and arranged her skirt, and she answered Rand Mosby for 1 hour and 20 minutes in a voice of complete composure, and she never once said anything that was not true. That is the thing I want you to understand about her, and it took me years. She did not lie in that chair. She said that she had signed for the box at the depot, and that she had done it because her brother was not fit to be at the depot. She said that she had ordered the stone, and that somebody had to order the stone. She said that she had paid the account at Ardsley every quarter and entered it under repairs, because the whole county did not need to be told the family's business, and that she had never once told any living soul that her sister-in-law was dead. "Miss Ames," said Mosby, "did you tell the Reverend Josiah Truitt that Mrs. Ames had died at Redwater?" "I did not. Dr. Spite furnished the certificate to Mr. Truitt." "Did you tell your brother that his wife was dead?" "Dr. Spite told my brother." "Did you at any time correct him?" And Loretta Ames said, "It was not my place to instruct my brother in his own affairs." Mosby stood there and let the whole room have it. 410 mill hands were out in that square. There were 200 people in that room and a gallery over them, and there was not a sound. "Miss Ames," he said, "in 3 years and 5 months, did you ever say the words, 'She is not dead'?" "No." "Was there any reason you did not?" "Nobody asked me," said Loretta Ames. Then Mosby put the mortgage in front of her, and the recorder's certificate, and the copied sheets in Merritt's hand, and she looked at them, and for the first time that day something happened in that face. It was very small, It was the look of a woman who has come into a room and found the door open, and has understood that it was open from the inside, and by whom. "Your nephew copied these," she said. "He did, ma'am." She turned her head then, for the first time in 2 hours and 10 minutes, and she looked down the room at Merritt Ames, and Merritt Ames looked back at her, and did not drop his eyes, and it was the end of 30 years. The judge discharged Delphine Rourke Ames at 20 minutes to 3 in the afternoon. He was old and he was deaf, and he had not much law in him beyond his county. But I have never heard anything better said by anybody in a black gown. He said that the writ had been returned, that the cause of the detention was 2 certificates, of which one was now sworn to be worthless by the man who made it, and the other stood on the word of a physician who had been told by this court to sit down. That no order of any court had ever placed this lady where she was. That she had been put there by a paper and kept there by a habit, and that in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, a habit is not a warrant. Then he said that the papers in the matter would go to the district attorney of the county that afternoon, and that he would sign a rule upon every person concerned to appear on the 4th of October. And then he leaned forward over the bench and said, "Mrs. Ames, you are at liberty. This court is sorry. It is not enough, and there is nothing else this court is permitted to say to you." She stood up out of that chair and said, "Thank you, sir," and turned around to the room. I have wondered ever since what she saw. 200 faces, and every one of them a face that had sat in a kitchen in that county for 3 years, saying she went off her head after her uncle died, and had believed it, and had been comfortable believing it. Nobody cheered. I want to say that, because when the Philadelphia papers got hold of it a week later, there was a great deal about the scene in the courtroom, and the scene in the courtroom was 200 people standing up in absolute silence and looking at the floor. We went out down the middle aisle, she and I, with Dovey behind us and Mrs. Prine behind Dovey with the parcel, and at the end of the second row, a big, gray, bearded man of 51 got to his feet with his hat in his hands. She stopped. The whole room stopped. Junius Ames said, "Delphine." And she looked at him for a moment, and she said, "You lit the lamp in the front room, and then you went out to the barn." Then she walked on, and that is the only sentence she ever spoke to her husband from that day to the end of his life. Outside on the steps, the square was solid people, and the sun was out, and Delphine Rourke stopped at the top of those steps and stood there with her hand over her eyes, because after 3 years and 5 months of one lawn, she could not bear that much light all at once, and I heard her say, mostly to herself, "It is a great deal bigger than I remembered." Then I said, because I could not hold it 1 second longer, "I never got one of them. Delphine, not one. My father put it in a cigar box, and he died." And she took her hand down from her eyes and looked at me, and after a moment she said, "Then say it again at breakfast." And I put my head down on that woman's shoulder in front of 400 people and cried the whole way through. And she stood there with her arms around me and let me do it, and did not once tell me that they were writing it down. Here is what became of it all, and I will give it to you plainly, because the working out of a thing like this is slower and colder than people expect. Tobias Renner came up from Philadelphia on the Saturday, 66 years old and gouty, and sat in Mrs. Vandegrift's front parlor with Delphine for 4 hours. He had never in 3 years signed the release of that fund, and he had been called an obstinate old man in 3 letters from Ashcombe for it. And when she thanked him, he said, "Madam, I did nothing whatever. I declined to do something. It is the only form of courage that costs a lawyer nothing, and I would not have you make more of it than it was. The orphans' court hearing on the 4th of October went on as fixed and took 11 minutes, and the petition was dismissed, and the fund stood. $52,000 in railroad bonds and 2 houses in Rourke Street, held for a woman who had been employed in a linen room at $40 a quarter. The rule of the 4th of October at Sadler Courthouse took 9 days in the end, and out of it came the indictments, and the case was tried at the December term. Orrin Spate was convicted of conspiracy and of making a false certificate, and was sentenced to 2 years in the Eastern Penitentiary, and was struck off by the state board in the spring, and he was 61 years old. He served 19 months. He came back to the county afterward because he had nowhere else, and he lived with a married daughter at Redwater, and he did not practice, and men who had taken their hats off to him for 20 years crossed Bell Street rather than pass him. Loretta Ames was convicted of conspiracy. The mortgage was set aside as fraudulent upon the petition of the mill's creditors, and the whole of her estate, the $14,000, and the accumulations, and 30 years of $40 and $60 and $100 entered under repairs, went into a receivership, and she was left, by the decree of a court, without the power to lay out $1 of her own money, without the consent of a man appointed to consent. She was sentenced to 18 months. She was 58 years old, and she served the whole of it, and never once asked anybody to intercede. I have said that the punishment fits in this world more rarely than people like to think. In her case, it fits so exactly that I have never been able to take any pleasure in it. She had put a woman where she could not walk out of a door, and had had the disposing of her money and the writing of her character, and had done it in a kind voice for the good of the family. She came out of the county jail in the summer of 1889 to a receiver's allowance of $9 a week in a boarding house in another town, where a landlady told her what time dinner was. And the county of Sadler, which had taken its opinions from her for 30 years, did the one thing left that it knew how to do, which was to stop saying her name. Within 2 years, there were people in Ashcombe who spoke of Loretta Ames in the past tense, while she was alive and 12 miles off. The mill was sold at the sheriff's sale in the March of 1888, and the wheel in the bend of the Wissahick stopped in the second week of that month, and the whole town came out to hear it, because none of them had ever in their lives heard that valley without it. Merritt Ames took the picking house and the 2 old sets of cards and started again on custom work with 11 hands, and paid off the last of it in 1896, and he is there yet. My marriage was declared void by decree in the January, on the ground that at the time of its solemnization, Junius Ames had a lawful wife living, and my name went back to Verna Kelso. And there was a paragraph about it in 2 Philadelphia papers, with the words, "The third Mrs. Ames," in the headline. And I have never been able to look at those 3 words since. I did not divorce him. There was nothing to divorce. I want that understood, because for about 6 months I was a curiosity, and there were letters, and there was one preacher in a county I had never been to who said from his pulpit that a woman who marries with a purpose in her heart is not much better than the people she is hunting. And I sat in Mrs. Vandegrift's kitchen and read that in the paper and thought about it honestly for a long time. Here is where I have come out after 40 years. He is not wrong. I did marry a man for a purpose he did not know, and I stood up in a front room and made promises in front of a minister that I did not mean, and I have never once called that a good thing. What I have said and will keep saying until they carry me out is that there was a woman in a linen room in the hills who was writing to me every week, and that there was not one honest door into that house, and that I looked for one for 11 weeks and there was not one. If a person can tell me the road I ought to have taken instead, I will listen. Nobody has yet. Junius Ames lived another 9 years. He kept the house on Bell Street for 2 of them, and then it went, and he took 2 rooms over the harness shop across from Rand Mosby's office. And he was seen most days on the bench outside the depot. And Merritt kept him. Dovey would not live with him. He was never charged with anything, and I have thought for 40 years about whether that was right, and I did not know. He signed it. He was told a lie, and he wanted the lie, and he signed his name at the bottom of it, and he went out to the barn. There is no statute for that. There ought to be a word for it at least. Dovey Ames came to us at Rourke Street in the November, at 17, with 1 box, and Delphine paid for her schooling, and she taught primary school in Germantown for 11 years, and then married a man named Rand Mosby, who had waited, and they had 4 children, and the eldest of them is called Verna, and the second is called Alma. Ezra Culp died at Redwater in the January, 4 months to the week, as he had said. There was nobody to bury him. Delphine paid for it, and we went up on the branch line in the snow, the 2 of us and Dr. Vandemark, and there were 5 people at that grave, and she had a stone put with his name and the dates, and nothing else, because, she said, anything else would have been a lie one way or the other. And in the spring we did the last of it. Ardsley's burial book, when the district attorney had it, showed one interment for the month of June, 1884, on the 16th. A woman of about 50 entered 9 years before as number 9, no friends, no name given, dead of a decline. The house had buried her in its own ground on the hill behind the west wing, without a marker, and 11 days later, a sealed coffin had gone down to Ashcombe on the noon train. They had had a body, and they had had a death, and neither of them was Delphine's. And it took 2 doctor's certificates and a sealed box, and 1 woman at a depot saying the poor thing wasted to nothing, and the county of her birth put a stone over it. In the May of 1888, by order of the court, that grave in the Ames plot was opened. What was in it was taken up to Ardsley and put back in the ground on the hill behind the west wing, where the woman had been buried the first time, and Delphine had a stone cut for her out of her own money, and because Mrs. Alma Prine had gone through 19 years of the house books to find it, that stone has a name on it, Sabina Roop. Died the 16th of June, 1884. She had been 9 years in that house, and no one had ever come. The small marble in the Ames plot at Ashcombe was taken up and broken, and the pieces went into the foundation of Merritt's picking house, which was his idea, and which I think was the best idea anybody had in that entire business. We took the houses at Rourke Street. Delphine let one, and we lived in the other, and she was ill that first winter in a way I will not describe, and there were months in 1889 when she could not go into a room if the door was shut behind her, and I slept in a chair by her bed from November to March. She got better, not all the way. She never afterward could bear to have her hair cut, and she would not have a clock in a bedroom, and to the end of her life she woke at 5, because that is when the bell went at Ardsley. And she went to work. That is the part I would want on her stone if there were room. In 1890, she and Renner's firm and 2 women from a Philadelphia committee began going into the private houses in that state with a petition and a lawyer. And in 1891, she gave evidence in Harrisburg before a committee of the legislature for 3 hours on the subject of the commitment of married women upon the application of a relative and the certificate of 2 physicians. And there is a law on the books of that Commonwealth today that a woman may not be so received without notice and a hearing. And there is a paragraph in the committee's report that begins, "The testimony of Mrs. D.R. Ames of Philadelphia. She got 7 women out. I have the names. 2 of them had been in longer than she had. The album is in front of me on this table. It is the blue one." Dovey carried it down her father's back stairs at 7 o'clock in the morning with her boots in her hand and gave it back to Delphine on the steps of the courthouse. And Delphine kept it 40 years, and it came to me in the spring with the rest of her things. The 9th leaf still says, "To D.R., who told me to go down and say it again at breakfast. I said it. V.K. Rockridge, 1880. The leaf after the school ones is still gone. We never found it and we never will, and I have long since stopped wanting it. But on the leaf after that, in a hand that took 2 years to come back to her, and that was never quite the round schoolgirl hand again, there is this, and it is dated the 12th of March, 1888, which is the week the wheel stopped in the bend of the Wissahick, and the whole town came out to hear it. The wheel has stopped. I am yours anyhow. D.R. I was 23 years old when I married a man to open a door, and I am 66 now, and there is a boarding house on Canal Street that I own, and Ottilie Vandegrift left me, and there is a stone up at Redwater with a strange woman's name on it, and there is a line in a statute book in Harrisburg. That is what came of a smudged postmark that a sick old shopkeeper put in a cigar box and forgot. I have been asked whether I would have gone if I had known the price. My name in 2 newspapers, my marriage struck out of a register, a man on a bench outside a depot for 9 years, and a girl of 17 who lost her whole family in one afternoon in a parlor. I would have gone. She was 3 years in that room, and she never once got an answer to a letter. And on the day I finally came, she looked at me and thought I might not be there. Well, friends, that is where the story leaves us, and I have a question for you. Junius Ames signed that paper because his sister told him a lie he wanted to hear, and he went to the barn, and he was never charged with anything at all. Do you believe he was a weak man who was used? Or do you believe that a man who does not look is choosing just the same as a man who does? Tell me what you think in the comments, because I have carried that one for 40 years, and I have never settled it, and I read every one. Thank you for staying with me all this way. There should be a playlist coming up on your screen with other stories from this channel, and I would love for you to stay a while longer.